Some promises we make to children echo through the years in ways we never expect. There's something beautiful about innocent love that refuses to fade, even when the world tries to tell us it's foolish. Little Catrin gave her heart to Duke Rowan when she was just 10 years old. He smiled kindly and said, "Come back when you're older, little one." Years passed. She grew into a woman while he carried the weight of his duties. When she finally returned, neither was prepared for how that childhood moment would change everything. Will the Duke remember the peasant girl who loved him so purely? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning mist clung to the golden fields of Briarstead like a gentle embrace, rolling across the countryside in soft waves that caught the early sunlight. Catrin Whitmore straightened her back against the weight of the grain sack, her calloused hands steady despite the burden. At 22, she had grown into the kind of woman who commanded quiet respect in their small hamlet, not through beauty alone, though her flaxen hair still caught the light as it had when she was small, but through the steadiness of her character and the gentle strength in her green eyes. She paused at the edge of Willem's field, her father's land, and gazed toward the stone road that wound its way up the hill to Highmere Manor. The Duke's estate sat like a crown upon the landscape, its ancient walls weathered but dignified, windows glinting in the morning sun. From this distance, she could make out the banners fluttering from the towers, the same deep blue and silver she remembered from childhood visits to the village market when the Duke's men would come to collect taxes and settle disputes. Those memories stirred something in her chest, a flutter of remembrance that she tried to push away as she did most mornings. But today felt different somehow, as if the autumn air itself carried whispers of the past. 12 years ago, the memory came unbidden, as they often did when she looked toward the manor. She had been 10 then, all braids and bare feet, racing through the village square during the harvest festival. The young Duke Rowan, barely 19 himself, had come down from his estate to join the celebration, a gesture that had surprised everyone, as his late father had rarely mingled with common folk. She could still see him as he was then, tall and lean, with dark hair that refused to stay properly combed and kind brown eyes that seemed to take in everything around him. He wore simple clothes that day, trying to blend in, but there was something about the way he carried himself that marked him as nobility. Perhaps it was the careful way he spoke, or how even the village elders deferred to him with respectful nods. Catrin had been watching him from behind her father's market stall, fascinated by this young man who seemed so different from the stern portraits she'd glimpsed in the manor's windows during formal processions. When a group of village children started a game of chase, weaving between the stalls and laughing, she had joined them without thinking. The game led them in circles, and she had been running so hard, so focused on not being caught, that she hadn't seen the Duke standing directly in her path until it was too late. The collision sent her tumbling backward onto the cobblestones, skinning her palms and bringing tears to her eyes. But instead of the scolding she expected from him or from the horrified adults who had witnessed the accident, Duke Rowan had knelt beside her, his face full of genuine concern. "Are you hurt, little one?" His voice was gentle, without any of the stern authority she'd expected. He helped her to her feet, examining her scraped hands with the kind of care her father might show. "These need tending. Come, let's find your parents." But Catrin had stood there, staring up at him, her young heart suddenly full of something she couldn't name. Perhaps it was the kindness in his eyes, or the way he spoke to her as if she mattered, not just as a peasant child who had inconvenienced him. In that moment, with the certainty that only children possess, she knew she loved him. "I'm going to marry you," she announced, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. The adults within earshot gasped, and she heard her father's sharp intake of breath from somewhere behind her. But Duke Rowan had simply smiled, not the condescending smile adults often gave children, but something warmer and more genuine. "Is that so?" he asked, his tone serious, despite the gentle amusement in his eyes. "Yes," Catrin had replied with absolute conviction. "I love you." He had knelt then, bringing himself to her eye level, and placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "That's very flattering, little one, but you're rather young for such serious matters, don't you think?" "I'll grow up," she had said simply. Duke Rowan had been quiet for a moment, studying her face with those kind brown eyes. Then he had smiled again and said the words that had echoed in her heart for 12 long years. "Come back when you're older, little one. We'll see then." Before she could respond, he had pressed something into her small palm, a smooth river stone, warm from his pocket. She had looked down at it, then back up at him. But he was already rising to speak with her father, who had hurried over with apologies spilling from his lips. Now, standing in the morning mist, with that same stone tucked safely in her apron pocket, carried there every day for 12 years, Catrin felt the weight of time and change. The Duke's words had been kind, meant to let a child down gently. She understood that now, had understood it even as she grew older. But understanding and forgetting were different things entirely. Catrin. Her father's voice called from the cottage, breaking her reverie. Willem Whitmore stood in the doorway, his weathered face creased with concern. At 55, he bore the marks of a lifetime spent working the land, but his eyes were still sharp, and his love for his daughter evident in every glance. "You'll catch your death standing out there in the mist," he said, though his tone was gentle. "Come, your grandmother has breakfast waiting." Catrin shouldered her sack and walked toward the small stone cottage that had been her home all her life. It was humble but well kept, with a thatched roof her father repaired each spring, and a garden where her grandmother Marta grew herbs and vegetables. The walls were thick enough to keep out the winter cold, and the hearth was always warm. It was a good life, she reminded herself. A simple life, but an honest one. Inside, the cottage smelled of porridge and herbs. Grandmother Marta sat by the fire, her silver hair neatly braided and her blue eyes still bright, despite her 73 years. She looked up as Catrin entered, and her expression grew thoughtful. "You've been looking toward the manor again," Marta observed. It wasn't a question. Willem frowned. "Mother, don't encourage such foolishness." "Is it foolishness to remember kindness?" Marta asked mildly, continuing to stir the porridge. "The young Duke was good to our Catrin that day, better than many nobles would have been." "That was 12 years ago," Willem said firmly. "She was a child and he was being polite, nothing more." Catrin sat at the wooden table her father had built before she was born, accepting the bowl of porridge her grandmother offered. The conversation felt familiar. They'd had variations of it many times over the years, especially when well-meaning neighbors would mention Duke Rowan's continued unmarried state, or when news filtered down from the manor about his life and duties. "The Duke is 28 now," Marta continued, seemingly unaware of Willem's warning glance. "Still unwed, though Lord knows they've tried to match him with half the eligible ladies in the kingdom. Lady Beatrice of Thornfield has been visiting quite regularly this past year." "And what concern is that of ours?" Willem asked, though Catrin noticed he kept his voice carefully neutral. Her father was not unkind, but he was practical above all else. The idea of his daughter harboring feelings for someone so far above their station worried him deeply. Lady Beatrice. Catrin had heard the name whispered in the village market, always accompanied by nods of approval. She was reportedly everything a duke's wife should be, well-born, accomplished, beautiful, and versed in the arts of managing a great household. The daughter of Lord Thornfield, she would bring political connections and a substantial dowry to any marriage. By all accounts, she was perfect for Duke Rowan. "It's no concern of ours," Catrin said quietly, though the words felt heavy in her mouth. "I know that, father. We all know that." But even as she spoke the words, her fingers found the smooth stone in her apron pocket. She had carried it for so long that it had worn to a perfect oval, warm and comforting against her palm. "Come back when you're older, little one." Well, she was older now. 22 years old, with hands that knew honest work and a heart that had never forgotten the kindness in a young duke's eyes. She helped her father with the farming, tended their small garden, and had even learned to read and write from the village priest, an unusual accomplishment for a peasant woman, but one her father had encouraged. She could manage a household, had turned down 3 marriage proposals from good men in the village, and was known throughout Briarstead for her gentle wisdom and quick wit. But she was still a peasant, and he was still a duke. "The Harver boy asked about you again yesterday," Willem said carefully, breaking into her thoughts. "Thomas, he's built up a fine smithy business, and he's always treated you with respect." Thomas Harver, the blacksmith's son, now the blacksmith himself since his father's death 2 winters past. He was a good man, honest, hard-working, with kind eyes and strong hands. He'd been patient in his courtship, never pressing, always respectful. Any woman in the village would be fortunate to marry him. "Thomas is a good man," Catrin agreed, because it was true. "But," Marta prompted gently. Catrin sighed. "But I don't love him, grandmother. Not the way a wife should love her husband." "Love can grow," Willem said, echoing the practical wisdom of their station. "Respect and kindness are fine foundations for a marriage." "They are," Catrin agreed again. "And perhaps it's time I stopped letting childish dreams stand in the way of a good life." The words hurt to say, but she meant them. Or she tried to mem. Marta reached across the table and covered Catrin's hand with her own. Her grandmother's skin was soft and warm, weathered by years, but still gentle. "Dreams aren't always childish, dear one," she said softly. "Sometimes they're just waiting for the right moment to become real." Willem made a sound of disapproval. "Mother, please. Don't fill her head with fairy tales." "Who says anything about fairy tales?" Marta asked, her eyes twinkling with something that might have been mischief. "I'm simply saying that life has a way of surprising us. The young Duke has remained unwed for many years now, despite considerable pressure from his advisors. Perhaps he, too, is waiting for something. He's waiting for the right political alliance," Willem said firmly. "Lords don't marry for love, Mother. They marry for advantage." But as Catrin helped clear the breakfast dishes, she found herself thinking about her grandmother's words. Duke Rowan had indeed remained unmarried far longer than most men of his station. In the village, there were whispers about his apparent reluctance to choose a bride, despite the urgings of his chief adviser, Lord Aldrich Thornwall, a stern man in his 60s who had served the ducal house for decades. The gossip suggested that Lady Beatrice was the current favourite for his hand, and that an announcement might come soon. Her family had significant holdings in the northern provinces, and such an alliance would strengthen the duchy's position against potential threats from neighbouring lords. It made perfect sense from a political standpoint, and yet he hadn't announced anything yet. As Catrin stepped outside to tend to their small garden, she found herself looking toward the manor again. The morning mist was clearing, revealing the full grandeur of Highmere's ancient stones. Somewhere within those walls, Duke Rowan was likely beginning his own day, meeting with advisors, reviewing reports from his stewards, making decisions that affected the lives of everyone in the duchy. Did he ever think about that autumn day 12 years ago? Did he remember a small girl with scraped palms and 2 bold declarations of love? Did he still carry her memory as she carried his, or had it been lost among the countless responsibilities and pressures of his position? She knelt among the late vegetables, pulling weeds with practiced efficiency. The physical work helped settle her thoughts, as it always did. Her hands knew this soil, these plants. This was her world, simple, honest, predictable. A world where she belonged. But as she worked, her fingers once again found the smooth stone in her pocket, and she couldn't help but wonder what might happen if she were to walk up that stone road. Not as a child this time, but as the woman she had become. Would he remember her? Would he see in her face the girl who had loved him so freely and completely? The thought both thrilled and terrified her. "You're thinking about him again." Catrin looked up to find Thomas Harver standing at the garden gate, his broad frame silhouetted against the morning sun. His dark hair was already damp with sweat despite the early hour, and his leather apron marked him as having come straight from his forge. "Thomas," she said, rising and brushing dirt from her skirts. "You're abroad early. Mrs. Fletcher's plough needs mending before the final harvest," he said, but his eyes were gentle as they studied her face. You looked distant, thoughtful. She had known Thomas all her life. They had played together as children, learned their letters from the same priest, grown up in the comfortable familiarity of village life. He knew her moods, her expressions, her tendency to lose herself in dreams while working in the garden. "I'm always thoughtful in the mornings," she said lightly. "It's the best time for it." Thomas smiled, but there was something serious in his brown eyes. "Catrin, I know I've spoken of this before, but I hope you'll consider. That is, I would very much like to call on you properly. With your father's permission." The proposal hung in the morning air between them, honest and patient and kind. Thomas had been building up to this moment for months, his courtship gentle but determined. He was offering her a good life, not wealthy but comfortable. He would be a faithful husband, a loving father to their children. She would want for nothing within their means, and she would be respected as the blacksmith's wife. It was everything a woman in her position could hope for. "Thomas," she began. But he raised a hand gently. "You don't need to answer now," he said. "I know you've much to consider, but I wanted you to know that my feelings haven't changed. If anything, they've grown stronger." He turned to go, then paused. "Whatever dreams you're chasing, Catrin, I hope you find what you're looking for. You deserve happiness wherever it might be found." After he left, Catrin remained in the garden, staring down at the vegetables without really seeing them. Thomas's proposal was kind and generous, and it forced her to confront the choice she had been avoiding for months. She could accept his offer and build a life within the boundaries of her birth. She would be a good wife, a devoted mother, a respected member of their community. She would put away childish dreams and embrace the reality of her circumstances. It would be a good life, an honest life, or she could continue as she was, unmarried and increasingly the subject of village speculation, holding on to a memory that might mean nothing to the man who had inspired it, unless, the thought came suddenly, startling in its clarity, unless she simply asked, what if, instead of wondering and dreaming and carrying this secret hope for the rest of her life, she simply walked up that stone road and discovered the truth. Not as a child this time, but as a woman grown. She could speak to Duke Rowan as an adult, see if he remembered her, learn once and for all whether the kindness she remembered had been mere politeness or something more. The idea terrified her. The social barriers were immense. A duke and a peasant woman inhabited entirely different worlds. Even if he remembered her kindly, even if he had harbored some affection for the bold child she had been, the realities of their positions made any deeper connection impossible. He would marry Lady Beatrice or someone like her, and she would marry Thomas or someone like him, and that would be the natural order of things. But perhaps knowing for certain would give her the closure she needed to move forward with her life. Perhaps facing the truth, however painful, would finally allow her to let go of dreams that were never meant to be. As the morning progressed into afternoon, the idea took root and grew stronger. By evening, as she helped her grandmother prepare supper, Catrin had made her decision. "I'm going to the manor tomorrow," she announced suddenly. Willem looked up from his bowl, startled. "What did you say?" "I'm going to speak with Duke Rowan," Catrin said, her voice steadier than she felt. "About the harvest taxes. Father Miller mentioned that several families are struggling this year, and someone should speak for them. It was a reasonable excuse. The church often sent representatives to discuss village concerns with the Duke's stewards. But Willem's expression suggested he wasn't entirely convinced by her explanation. "That's typically handled through Lord Aldrich," he said carefully, "and usually by the men of the village council. Then perhaps it's time for a different approach," Catrin replied. "I can read and write, I know the family's affected, and I'm not intimidated by authority. Why shouldn't I go?" Marta looked up from her mending, her eyes bright with something that might have been approval. "Why indeed? Our Catrin has a good head on her shoulders and a kind heart. If anyone can speak eloquently for the village's needs, it would be her." Willem frowned. "It's not proper for an unmarried woman to go calling at the manor alone." "Then I'll ask Mrs. Fletcher to accompany me," Catrin said. "She's a widow, so there can be no impropriety." And her family is among those struggling with this year's taxes. She had thought it through, prepared her arguments, convinced herself that her motives were purely altruistic. But even as she spoke, her fingers found the smooth stone in her pocket, and she knew that village taxes were only part of the reason for her decision. 12 years was long enough to wonder. It was time to know the truth, whatever it might be. That night, as she lay in her small bed under the cottage's slanted roof, Catrin stared up at the dark beams and tried to imagine what tomorrow might bring. Would the Duke remember her at all? Would he be kind, as he had been before, or would the years and responsibilities have changed him? Would seeing him again finally put her childhood dreams to rest, or would it only make the truth of their impossible circumstances more painful? Outside her window, the moon cast silver light across the fields of Briarstead, and in the distance the windows of Highmere Manor glowed like distant stars. Somewhere within those ancient walls, Duke Rowan was perhaps lying in his own bed, unaware that tomorrow would bring a visitor from his past. Tomorrow, she would walk up that stone road not as a child, with scraped palms and impossible dreams, but as a woman with questions that had waited 12 years for answers. Tomorrow, she would finally discover whether some promises were meant to be kept, or if they were simply the kind words of a young man trying to comfort a heartbroken child. Tomorrow, everything would change. The stone road to Highmere Manor stretched before Catrin like a ribbon of memory, each familiar cobble seeming to whisper of the past as she walked. The morning air carried the scent of wood smoke and autumn leaves, and despite her carefully rehearsed reasons for this visit, her heart beat with the rhythm of a woman walking toward her destiny rather than her duty. Mrs. Fletcher walked beside her, her weathered hands clutching a worn leather satchel containing the carefully written petition regarding the harvest taxes. Eleanor Fletcher was a practical woman of 53, widowed these past 5 years and known throughout the village for her forthright manner and fierce protection of her 3 grown children. If anyone could lend respectability to this mission, it was she. "You're certain the Duke will see us?" Mrs. Fletcher asked as they climbed the gentle slope. "Lord Aldrich is known to be particular about unexpected visitors." Catrin adjusted the silver locket at her throat, her mother's locket, the only thing of value she owned, worn today for courage as much as propriety. "Duke Rowan has always been approachable regarding village concerns," she said, though her voice carried more confidence than she felt. "And our petition is reasonable. Several families truly are struggling with this year's assessment." It was true, all of it. The summer had been unusually dry, affecting crop yields throughout the duchy. The Prescott family had lost half their barley crop, and old Henrik's apple orchard had produced barely enough for his own family, let alone the market. The village council had debated the matter for weeks without reaching consensus on how to approach the Duke's stewards. But as they walked, Catrin could feel the weight of the smooth riverstone in her pocket, and she knew that noble concern for her neighbours was only part of what drew her up this hill. The manor gates came into view, tall iron spears crowned with the Highmere coat of arms, a silver hawk on a field of deep blue. 2 guards stood at attention, their mail gleaming in the morning sun, and Catrin felt a flutter of nervousness as they approached. "State your business," the taller guard said, his voice formal but not unkind. Mrs. Fletcher stepped forward with the confidence of a woman who had negotiated with merchants and dealt with tax collectors her entire married life. "We're here on behalf of the village council to speak with His Grace about the harvest assessment. I'm Eleanor Fletcher, and this is Catrin Whitmore. We have a written petition." The guard's eyes moved to Catrin, and she saw the moment when recognition failed to spark. Why would it? She had been a child of 10 when last she passed through these gates, and he would have no reason to remember one small peasant girl among so many. "The Duke is in audience with his stewards this morning," the guard said after examining Mrs. Fletcher's petition. "You may wait in the outer courtyard. I cannot promise he will see you today, but I will present your request." They were led through the gates into a courtyard Catrin remembered as vast and intimidating. It seemed smaller now, though no less impressive, with its ancient stones weathered smooth by centuries of wind and rain. A fountain played at the center, its gentle splash a counterpoint to the sound of horses being led to stable and the distant ring of metal on metal from the practice yards. "I remember when you came here as a child," Mrs. Fletcher said quietly, as they waited on a stone bench near the fountain. "During the harvest festival when you—" She paused delicately. "When I made a fool of myself," Catrin finished, though her tone held more fondness than embarrassment. "Yes, I remember too. The Duke was kind to you that day," Mrs. Fletcher observed. "Kinder than many nobles would have been to a peasant child who had—" Spoken out of turn, Catrin's fingers found the stone in her pocket. "He was very kind." They waited perhaps an hour, watching servants go about their morning duties and noting the quiet efficiency with which the great household operated. Catrin found herself studying the windows of the main hall, wondering which rooms the Duke occupied, whether he might even now be looking down at the courtyard and seeing her there. "Mistress Fletcher? Mistress Whitmore?" They turned to find a young man in the livery of a household servant approaching. He was perhaps 18, with the earnest demeanor of someone still learning his duties. "His Grace will see you now," the young man said, gesturing toward the main entrance. "If you would follow me, please." Catrin's heart quickened as they were led through corridors she half remembered from childhood glimpses. The walls were lined with tapestries depicting the history of the Hymir line. Battles fought, alliances forged, lands defended across generations. Portraits of previous dukes gazed down with serious eyes, and she noticed that many of them bore a resemblance to the young man she remembered from 12 years ago. They were shown into a receiving chamber that managed to be both grand and welcoming. Tall windows let in generous light, and while the furnishings spoke of wealth and position, they also suggested comfort and daily use. A fire burned cheerfully in the great hearth, and the scent of beeswax and herbs gave the room a homely quality despite its magnificence. "His Grace will be with you momentarily," the servant said. Bowing slightly before withdrawing, Catrin used the time to steady her breathing and remind herself why she had come. She was here as a representative of her community to discuss legitimate concerns about taxation and harvest yields, that she might also discover whether a childhood memory held any lasting significance was secondary. The sound of footsteps in the corridor made both women rise and turn toward the door. Catrin felt her breath catch as Duke Rowan entered the chamber. He was 31 now, no longer the young man of 19 she held in her memories. The years had refined his features, adding character lines around his eyes and a more serious cast to his expression. His dark hair was shorter now, neatly trimmed in the fashion of nobility, and he moved with the confident bearing of a man accustomed to command. He was dressed simply but richly in dark blue wool that complemented his eyes, with no ornament save a silver signet ring that caught the light. But it was still him, still the man who had knelt beside a fallen child and spoken with kindness rather than irritation. "Mistress Fletcher, Mistress Whitmore," he said, his voice deeper than she remembered, but carrying the same warmth. "Thank you for coming. I understand you wish to discuss matters concerning the harvest assessment." His eyes moved between them as he spoke, polite and attentive, and when they rested on Catrin, she searched desperately for any sign of recognition. For a moment she thought she saw something flicker in his expression, a pause, a slight narrowing of his eyes, as if he were trying to place a half-remembered face. But then Mrs. Fletcher was speaking, presenting their petition with the practiced eloquence of a woman who had argued her case before merchants and magistrates. She spoke of crop failures and family hardships, of good people struggling to meet obligations despite circumstances beyond their control. Duke Rowan listened with genuine attention, asking thoughtful questions and making notes on a piece of parchment. His manner was everything Catrin had hoped, engaged, compassionate, clearly concerned for the welfare of his people. Whatever else the years might have changed about him, they had not diminished his fundamental decency. "These are valid concerns," he said when Mrs. Fletcher had finished. I will review the assessment records with my stewards and see what accommodations can be made. The duchy's strength comes from the prosperity of its people, not from taxing them beyond their means. You are most gracious, Your Grace, Mrs. Fletcher said with a respectful curtsy. The village is grateful for your consideration. It was clearly a dismissal, courteous but final. Mrs. Fletcher gathered her things and prepared to leave, but Catrin found herself rooted to the spot, staring at the man who had shaped so many of her dreams and wondering if this brief, businesslike exchange was truly all there would be. Duke Rowan had turned toward his desk, already reaching for other documents, but something made him look back. His eyes met hers across the chamber, and this time the pause was longer, more deliberate. She saw the exact moment when recognition dawned. A slight widening of his eyes, a stillness that had nothing to do with courtesy and everything to do with memory. Catrin? The name escaped him almost as a whisper, uncertainty and wonder mingling in his voice. Mrs. Fletcher stopped at the door, looking between them with growing understanding. Your Grace, Catrin said, finding her voice at last. You remember. He stared at her for a long moment, taking in the woman she had become. The little girl from the harvest festival, he said slowly. But you've grown up. 12 years, she said simply. As you said I should. The silence stretched between them, heavy with memory and the weight of all the years that had passed. Mrs. Fletcher cleared her throat gently. Perhaps I should wait in the courtyard, she suggested tactfully. Duke Rowan seemed to remember where he was, and with whom. Forgive me. Yes, of course. Thank you, Mistress Fletcher. Someone will bring you refreshment while you wait. When they were alone, he moved closer, studying her face with an intensity that made her heart race. I can see her, he said wonderingly. The child you were. In your eyes, in the way you hold your head when you're being stubborn. I'm not being stubborn, Catrin protested, then caught herself and laughed. Well, perhaps I am. I suppose some things don't change. No, he said, and something in his voice made her look at him more closely. Some things don't change at all. Another silence fell. But this one was different, charged with recognition and possibility and the awkward awareness that they were no longer child and young man, but woman and man, separated by circumstances that had only grown more complicated with time. You kept your word, Duke Rowan said finally. You came back when you were older. Catrin's hand moved unconsciously to her pocket, to the stone she had carried for 12 years. Did you think I wouldn't? I hoped, he admitted, and the honesty in his voice surprised them both. I used to wonder sometimes what became of the bold little girl who declared her intentions so fearlessly. And now you know, she said, though her voice was gentler than her words. A peasant woman come to petition about taxes. Is that truly why you came? He asked, stepping closer still. The question hung in the air between them, demanding honesty. Catrin could lie, could hide behind her carefully prepared excuse and preserve the proprieties. But looking into his eyes, those same kind brown eyes that had shown her such gentleness all those years ago, she found she couldn't dissemble. Partly, she said. The petition is real and the need genuine, but, he prompted when she hesitated. But I also wanted to know if you remembered me, she admitted. If that day meant anything beyond a nobleman being kind to a foolish child. Duke Rowan was quiet for a long moment, studying her face. When he spoke, his voice was soft but serious. It meant more than you know, he said. More than it should have, perhaps. The admission sent a thrill through her, followed immediately by the cold touch of reality. Whatever meaning that long-ago encounter had held, whatever significance this moment might have, the fundamental facts remained unchanged. He was a duke, heir to an ancient line, with responsibilities that extended far beyond personal inclination. She was a peasant woman, well-bred perhaps by village standards, but utterly beneath his station by the laws that governed their world. Your Grace, she began, stepping back and trying to restore some proper distance between them. Rowan, he corrected gently. When we're alone, please. I've heard Your Grace from 100 mouths today, but I haven't heard my name from yours in 12 years. Rowan, she repeated, and the name felt both familiar and strange on her lips. I should not have come. This was unwise. Why? He asked, and she heard genuine curiosity in the question. Because, she said, frustrated by his apparent obtuseness, because you are who you are, and I am who I am, and there are some gaps that cannot be bridged by kindness or fond memories, are there? He asked quietly. Are you so certain? Before she could answer, the sound of approaching footsteps echoed in the corridor. Duke Rowan stepped back quickly, his expression shifting to one of polite formality, just as the chamber door opened to admit a stern-faced man in rich robes. Lord Aldrich Thornwall was exactly as imposing as village gossip had painted him, tall, silver-haired, with the bearing of a man accustomed to being obeyed. His pale eyes moved between them with sharp intelligence, and Catrin saw his slight frown as he took in the scene. Your Grace, Lord Aldrich said with a slight bow, Lady Beatrice has arrived for her appointment. She waits in the blue salon. Of course, Duke Rowan replied smoothly, though Catrin noticed the way his jaw tightened. Thank you, Aldrich. I'll join her shortly. Lord Aldrich's gaze lingered on Catrin with barely concealed disapproval. I trust the village matter has been resolved satisfactorily? It has, Duke Rowan said firmly. Mistress Whitmore was representing legitimate concerns, which will be addressed appropriately. The dismissal was clear. But as Catrin prepared to leave, Duke Rowan spoke again. Mistress Whitmore, I wonder if you might call again tomorrow. There are additional aspects of the taxation matter that may require further discussion. Lord Aldrich's frown deepened, but he said nothing. Catrin felt her cheeks warm under his scrutiny, but she managed to maintain her composure. If your Grace thinks it necessary, she said formally. I do, Duke Rowan replied, his eyes holding hers for just a moment longer than propriety demanded. Good day, Mistress Whitmore. As she left the chamber, Catrin's mind was reeling. The brief reunion had been everything she had hoped for, and everything she had feared. He did remember her. Their childhood encounter had meant something to him, as it had to her. But the arrival of Lady Beatrice served as a sharp reminder of the realities that constrained them both. Mrs. Fletcher was waiting in the courtyard, her expression knowing but discreet. They walked back down the stone road in relative silence, each lost in her own thoughts. He's a good man, Mrs. Fletcher said finally, when the manor had disappeared behind them. Always has been, even as a lad. But goodness and possibility aren't always the same thing, child. I know, Catrin replied, though her voice lacked conviction. Do you? Mrs. Fletcher asked gently. Because that was no casual recognition I witnessed in there. And tomorrow's appointment has nothing to do with harvest taxes. Catrin had no answer for that, because Mrs. Fletcher was absolutely right. Whatever had passed between her and Duke Rowan in those few moments of private conversation had been far more significant than a routine discussion of village concerns. As they reached the outskirts of Briarstead, Catrin found herself looking back toward the manor one more time. Somewhere within those walls, Duke Rowan was likely sitting with Lady Beatrice, discussing the kind of future that noble marriages were built upon, alliances and advantages, bloodlines and dowries. But for a few minutes today, he had looked at a peasant woman with recognition and something that might have been longing. Tomorrow she would return to discover what that look might mean. Tomorrow she would learn whether some promises were worth the risk of everything she had ever known. The stone in her pocket seemed to pulse with warmth against her palm, a tangible reminder of words spoken in kindness 12 years ago. Come back when you're older. Little one, she had come back. Now she had to discover what came next. Duke Rowan stared at the ledger before him, the carefully written columns of figures blurring together as his mind wandered for the third time in as many minutes. The morning sun slanted through the tall windows of his study, casting golden rectangles across the polished oak desk. But he found himself thinking not of tax assessments or grain yields, but of green eyes and the way a woman's voice had softened when she spoke his name. Your Grace? He looked up to find his chief steward, Master Gregory, waiting with patient concern, The older man had been reciting the quarterly reports for the better part of an hour, and Rowan realized he had absorbed precious little of it. "Forgive me, Gregory. My mind seems elsewhere this morning. Perhaps we might continue this afternoon?" Master Gregory, a diplomatic man who had served the ducal house for 20 years, simply nodded. "Of course, Your Grace. Shall I have the afternoon appointment with Lady Beatrice moved to accommodate?" Lady Beatrice. Rowan felt a familiar tightness in his chest at the mention of her name. She was scheduled to take tea with him at 2 o'clock, their third such meeting this month. A part of what everyone understood to be a careful courtship leading toward an inevitable engagement announcement. "No," he said after a moment. "Lady Beatrice's appointment stands as scheduled." After Gregory left, Rowan rose from his desk and moved to the window that overlooked the approach road to the manor. From here, he could see the stone path that wound down through the valley toward Briarstead, the same path a certain peasant woman would walk later. Today, for their agreed-upon meeting about additional taxation matters, he pulled open the top drawer of his desk and withdrew. A small object wrapped in silk, unfolding the cloth, revealed a leather-bound journal, worn soft with handling and filled with his most private thoughts. It was a habit he had developed in his youth, recording not the official business of the duchy, which was documented elsewhere, but the personal reflections of a man trying to navigate the complex demands of his position. "She came back," he wrote, his pen moving steadily across the page. "After 12 years, Catrin Whitmore came back, just as she promised she would. The child I remember has become a remarkable woman. Intelligent, articulate, beautiful in a way that has nothing to do with fashion or artifice. When she looked at me today, I felt something I had not experienced in years. Recognition, yes, but something more. A sense of possibility." He paused, considering his next words carefully. "I have arranged to see her again tomorrow, ostensibly to discuss village concerns. But I must be honest with myself, if with no one else. My interest has little to do with taxation and everything to do with the woman she has become. This is dangerous territory. Aldrich would be horrified if he knew the direction of my thoughts. Lady Beatrice deserves better than a suitor whose mind wanders to impossible dreams. But I cannot stop thinking about the way she said my name." The journal entry was interrupted by a knock at his study door. "Enter," he called, quickly returning the journal to its drawer. To his surprise, it was Lord Aldrich himself who entered, his expression more serious than usual. The older man closed the door behind him and approached the desk with the measured steps of someone preparing for a difficult conversation. "Rowan," Aldrich began, using the familiar address that indicated this was a private discussion rather than formal business. "I hope you won't take offense if I speak plainly about yesterday's unexpected visitor." Rowan kept his expression carefully neutral. "Mistress Whitmore." She presented legitimate concerns on behalf of the village. "Surely you don't object to my hearing petitions from our own people?" "Of course not," Aldrich said, settling into the chair across from the desk. "Your accessibility to the common folk is one of your strengths as a leader. But I could not help but notice that your reaction to this particular petitioner was unusual." "In what way?" Aldrich studied him for a moment. "You recognized her. Not as a representative of the village, but personally. And unless I am much mistaken, she recognized you as well. There was no point in denying what had been obvious to anyone observing. She was a child I encountered years ago, at a harvest festival. I simply remembered her face." "I see." Aldrich's tone suggested he saw rather more than Rowan might have preferred. "And this childhood encounter has led you to arrange a second meeting with her today." Rowan felt a flash of irritation at the implication, though he knew Aldrich's concerns came from genuine loyalty rather than mere officiousness. "The village taxation matter requires follow-up," he said evenly. "Several families are experiencing genuine hardship. Taxation matters that could not be handled by the stewards. Concerns that require the personal attention of the Duke himself?" The questions hung in the air between them, and Rowan found himself caught between honesty and discretion. Aldrich had been his father's closest advisor and had guided Rowan through the early years of his rule. The older man's counsel had always been sound, his loyalty absolute. But this was territory where even the most trusted advisor could not follow. Sometimes a personal touch is called for, Rowan said finally. The people need to know that their duke cares about their welfare. Aldrich was quiet for a long moment, his pale eyes thoughtful. When he spoke again, his voice was gentle but firm. Rowan, you know I have nothing but your best interests at heart. Your father asked me to guide you, and part of that guidance involves pointing out potential complications. What sort of complications? The sort that arise when a young duke in need of a wife begins paying unusual attention to an attractive peasant woman, Aldrich said bluntly. Lady Beatrice's father is growing impatient for a formal announcement. Lord Thornfield has made significant concessions in the marriage negotiations, and he expects progress. Rowan felt the familiar weight of obligation settling on his shoulders. The proposed marriage to Lady Beatrice was more than a personal arrangement. It was a strategic alliance that would strengthen the duchy's position against potential threats from neighboring lords. Her family controlled key trade routes and had connections throughout the northern provinces. From every practical standpoint, it was an ideal match. I am aware of Lord Thornfield's expectations, Rowan said carefully. Are you also aware that postponing this alliance much longer could be seen as an insult to their house? Aldrich leaned forward slightly. These are delicate times, Rowan. The balance of power among the duchies is shifting. We need strong alliances now more than ever. And you believe my meeting with a village woman threatens that balance? I believe, Aldrich said slowly, that a duke who allows personal inclinations to interfere with political necessity risks more than his own happiness. He risks the stability of his entire realm. The words struck home, as Aldrich had no doubt intended them to. Rowan had inherited his title at 19 upon his father's death, and had spent the 12 years since learning to balance his own desires against the needs of his people. It was a lesson that had cost him dearly on more than one occasion. Your point is taken, Rowan said finally, but I will not be rushed into marriage, regardless of Lord Thornfield's impatience. When I choose a wife, it will be a decision made with full consideration of all factors, including the factor of a peasant woman who once knew you as a child. The question was direct enough to border on impertinence, but Rowan knew it came from genuine concern. Aldrich had watched him struggle with the loneliness of his position, had seen him turn away from potential matches that might have brought personal happiness but political complications. Including all factors, Rowan repeated, his tone making it clear the conversation was ended. After Aldrich left, Rowan returned to his position at the window. The morning was advancing toward noon, and soon it would be time for his appointment with Catrin. The practical part of his mind acknowledged that Aldrich's concerns were valid. Pursuing any sort of personal relationship with a peasant woman would indeed complicate his political situation dramatically. But another part of him, a part that had been dormant for too long, whispered that some things were worth the complication. At 11:30, he made his way to the old mill that sat beside the stream, marking the eastern boundary of the manor grounds. It was a place he remembered from childhood explorations, abandoned now for a decade since the new mill had been built closer to the village. The structure was still sound, its stone walls weathered but solid, and the great wheel turned lazily in the gentle current. He had suggested this location in the note he had sent to Catrin that morning, a message ostensibly about reviewing additional taxation records, but worded carefully enough that she would understand the true nature of their meeting. The mill was private enough for conversation, yet respectable enough that no scandal could attach to their being seen there. She arrived precisely at noon, walking across the meadow with the easy grace he remembered from childhood. She wore a simple dress of blue wool that brought out the color of her eyes, and her flaxen hair was braided in a practical style that nonetheless framed her face beautifully. In her hands, she carried a small basket that suggested she had legitimate business in this direction, perhaps gathering herbs or checking snares. "Your Grace," she said as she approached, offering a respectful curtsy that somehow managed to maintain dignity without subservience. Rowan, he corrected gently, as he had the day before. When we're alone, please. She studied his face for a moment, as if gauging his sincerity. Very well, Rowan. They stood for a moment in the awkward silence of two people who had been intimate as child and young man, but were now virtual strangers. The mill wheel creaked gently in the background, and somewhere nearby a lark sang from the hedgerow. This is where I used to come as a boy, Rowan said finally, gesturing toward the mill. When the pressures of lessons and protocol became too much, my tutor never thought to look for me here. It's peaceful, Catrin agreed, setting her basket down on a sun-warmed stone. I can see why you would choose it as a refuge. Do you have such a place? Somewhere you go when you need to think? She smiled, and he was struck by how the expression transformed her face. The apple orchard behind our cottage. There's an old tree with branches perfect for sitting. And from there you can see the whole valley spread out below. I should like to see that view sometime, he said, then immediately regretted the words. Such a statement was far too personal, too suggestive of a relationship that could never exist. But Catrin didn't seem offended. Perhaps someday you shall, she said simply. Another silence fell, but this one was less awkward, more contemplative. Rowan found himself studying her face, noting the way the sunlight brought out gold threads in her hair, the laugh lines around her eyes that spoke of a life filled with genuine joy despite its hardships. You said yesterday that you wondered about me sometimes, Catrin said suddenly. What did you wonder? The direct question surprised him, but he found himself answering honestly. Whether you married, whether you were happy, whether you still remembered that autumn day, or if it had faded like most childhood memories. I never married, she said. And yes, I remembered. I remember everything about that day. Everything. She reached into the pocket of her dress and withdrew something small wrapped in cloth. Unfolding it revealed the smooth riverstone he had pressed into her palm 12 years ago. I've carried it with me every day since, she said simply. Even when I told myself I was being foolish, even when others urged me to put away childish dreams, I couldn't bring myself to leave it behind. Rowan stared at the stone, moved beyond words that she had treasured such a small token for so long. I never expected, that is, I thought surely you would forget as children do. I was never very good at forgetting, Catrin said with a rueful smile, much to my father's frustration. He's been trying to convince me to marry Thomas Harver, the village blacksmith. A good man and a practical choice, but you haven't accepted him. No. She looked down at the stone in her palm. I kept telling myself I was waiting for something, but I was never quite sure what. Until yesterday. And now I know I was waiting to discover whether a childhood promise meant anything beyond kindness to a foolish little girl. The honesty in her voice was both invitation and challenge. Rowan felt the weight of the moment, the sense that his answer would determine not just this conversation, but the entire direction of both their lives. It meant everything, he said quietly. Then and now, the admission hung in the air between them, transformative in its simplicity. Catrin's eyes searched his face, looking for certainty, for truth, for some sign that this impossible situation might somehow find resolution. What happens now? She asked. It was the question he had been asking himself since the moment he recognized her in his receiving chamber. The rational answer was clear. Nothing could happen. He was bound by duty and political necessity to marry within his own class, to form alliances that would strengthen his duchy and secure his lineage. She was equally bound by the circumstances of her birth to accept a marriage that would provide security and respectability within her own social sphere. But standing here in the golden afternoon light, with the woman who had kept his token for 12 years, rational answers seemed less important than the simple truth of what he felt. I don't know, he said honestly, but I would like to find out. She smiled then, the same bright, fearless smile he remembered from childhood. So would I. They talked for another hour, sharing the stories of their separate lives, his burdens of leadership and loneliness, her joys and struggles as a farmer's daughter. The conversation flowed with surprising ease, as if the years between them had been days rather than decades. When it came time to part, they made arrangements to meet again in 3 days' time. It was a dangerous precedent, they both knew, but neither seemed willing to let this fragile connection slip away again. As Rowan walked back to the manor, his mind was already calculating the risks and possibilities of what they were contemplating. Aldrich would be horrified. Lady Beatrice would be hurt and insulted. The political ramifications could be significant, but for the first time in years, he felt truly alive. That evening, alone in his study, he took out his journal again and wrote, "Today I met with Catrin at the old mill, and we spoke as equals, as friends, perhaps as something more. She has kept my token all these years, can still remember every word of our childhood encounter. There is something between us that defies explanation, something that makes all my careful plans and political calculations seem suddenly less important than the simple fact of her smile. I know this path leads toward complications I am not prepared for, but I also know that I cannot walk away from it. Not again. Not when she looks at me as if I'm not a duke to be appeased or a prize to be won, but simply a man she might choose to love. God help us both." 3 days had never seemed so long. Catrin found herself distracted during the simplest tasks, burning the morning porridge, while lost in thoughts of conversation by the old mill, dropping stitches in her mending as she replayed every word Rowan had spoken. Her father noticed, of course. Willem Whitmore was too observant and too protective not to see the change in his daughter's demeanor. "You've been different since your visit to the manor," he said on the morning of her planned second meeting with Rowan. They were working side by side in the garden, harvesting the last of the autumn vegetables. But Catrin's attention kept drifting toward the stone road that led up the hill. "Different how?" she asked, though she kept her eyes on the turnips she was pulling from the earth. "Distracted. Thoughtful in a way that has nothing to do with village concerns." Willem straightened, brushing dirt from his hands. "The Duke granted your petition regarding the taxes. Word came down yesterday that several families will receive partial relief. A successful outcome that should make you happy, not distant." Catrin felt a warmth spread through her chest at the news. True to his word, Rowan had addressed the taxation concerns they'd discussed. It was a reminder that beneath their growing personal connection lay genuine care for his people, one of the qualities that had drawn her to him as a child and continued to move her as a woman. "I'm glad," she said sincerely. "The Prescott family especially needed that relief." "Yes," Willem agreed. "The Duke showed wisdom and compassion in his decision. But that doesn't explain why you're staring at the manor road as if expecting a messenger." Before Catrin could formulate a response, her grandmother's voice called from the cottage doorway. "Catrin, Thomas Harver is here to see you." She looked up to find Thomas standing beside Marta, his broad frame filling the cottage entrance. He wore his finest clothes, a clean linen shirt and well-mended brown wool doublet that emphasized his considerable strength. In his hands he held a small carved wooden object that made Catrin's heart sink with understanding. "Thomas," she said, rising and brushing earth from her skirts. "This is unexpected. I hope not unwelcome," he replied, though something in his brown eyes suggested he could already sense her answer. "I've brought something for you. Something I made." He extended his hands, revealing a beautifully carved wooden robin, no bigger than her palm, but exquisitely detailed. Every feather had been lovingly shaped, every curve of wing and breast rendered with the skill of a master craftsman. It was the kind of gift that spoke of weeks of careful work and deep feeling. "Thomas, it's beautiful," she said, and meant it. The little bird was a work of art, created by hands that knew both strength and delicacy. "You have such talent." "My father always said that iron was my calling," Thomas said with a shy smile. "But wood lets me show what's in my heart." Willem cleared his throat diplomatically. "Perhaps you young people would like some privacy for conversation. Catrin, why don't you show Thomas the apple orchard? The trees are lovely this time of year." It was both suggestion and gentle command. Catrin found herself walking alongside Thomas toward the small orchard behind their cottage. the carved robin cradled carefully in her hands. She could feel the weight of expectation in the air, could sense that this was more than a simple gift-giving. They stopped beneath the old apple tree she had mentioned to Rowan, the one with branches perfect for sitting and thinking. The irony was not lost on her that she was about to break the heart of one good man while standing in the place she had described to another. "Catrin," Thomas began, his voice serious despite its gentleness. "I know I've been patient, perhaps too patient, but I can't wait any longer to speak my feelings plainly." She looked at him, really looked, taking in the honesty in his face, the strength of his character written in every line of his expression. Thomas Harver was everything a woman should want: kind, hard-working, dependable, capable of providing both security and affection. He would be a faithful husband, a loving father, a partner who would never give her cause for doubt or worry. He was perfect for her, by every measure their world recognized. "I love you," he said simply. "I have for years, though I've been too cautious to say so. I want to marry you, to build a life with you. I have a house now, a successful trade, enough put by to support a family. All I lack is you." The little robin seemed to grow heavy in her hands, weighted with hope and expectation and the future he was offering. She could say yes. She should say yes. It would solve her father's concerns, end the village speculation about her unmarried state, give her the security and respectability that every woman needed. It would also mean the end of secret meetings at old mills and the impossible dreams that had shaped her. "Heart for 12 years, Thomas," she said softly. "You honor me with your feelings and your offer. Any woman would be fortunate to have your love, but not you." The question was quiet, resigned, as if he had already read her answer in her hesitation. She struggled for words that would be honest without being cruel. "I care for you deeply, as a friend, as someone I've known all my life. But the feeling you speak of, the love that should exist between husband and wife, I don't know if I can offer you that." Thomas was quiet for a long moment, studying the carved bird in her hands. "Is there someone else?" The direct question surprised her. She looked up to find him watching her with the kind of patient understanding that had always marked his character. There might be," she admitted, unable to lie to him completely. "The Duke." The words hit her like a physical blow. She stared at him, wondering how he could possibly know, what signs she had given, whether others in the village suspected as well. "I see the way you look toward the manor," Thomas continued gently. "I saw how you were after your visit there, and I remember the harvest festival, when we were children. The way you looked at him then." "That was 12 years ago," Catrin protested weakly. "Some feelings don't fade with time," Thomas said, and there was no accusation in his voice, only sadness. "Believe me, I know." They stood in silence under the apple tree, two people who cared for each other but could never love each other in the way that marriage required. Finally, Thomas reached out and gently closed her hands around the carved robin. "Keep it anyway," he said, "not as a token of courtship, but as a reminder that you have friends who wish you happiness, wherever you might find it." "Thomas, I won't press you further," he said, stepping back. "But Catrin, be careful. The path you're walking, it's dangerous, not just for you, but for him as well." After he left, Catrin remained in the orchard, holding the wooden robin and staring toward the manor. Thomas's warning echoed in her mind, mixing with her father's concerns and her own growing awareness of the risks they were taking. Every moment she spent with Rowan, every secret meeting, increased the danger for both of them. But when the appointed time came, she found herself walking toward the old mill anyway. Rowan was already there, leaning against the stone wall and gazing into the stream. He had traded his formal ducal attire for simpler clothes, riding boots, wool breeches, and a linen shirt that made him look younger, more like the man he might have been in a different life. When he saw her approaching, his entire face lit with a smile that made her heart race. "I wasn't certain you would come," he admitted as she drew near. "Neither was I, until the last moment," she replied honestly. They fell into step together, walking along the stream bank toward a secluded grove where willows draped their branches like curtains. It had become their private sanctuary, a place where Duke and peasant woman could speak as equals, where the complicated realities of their respective worlds seemed temporarily suspended. "Tell me about your childhood," Rowan said, as they settled on a fallen log that served as their customary seat. "Not the day we met, but before that. What was little Catrin like?" She laughed, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. "Stubborn, according to my father. Curious about everything, always asking questions that made the adults uncomfortable. I learned to read from Father Marcus because I pestered him until he agreed to teach me, just to have some peace. That explains the intelligence I see in your eyes," Rowan said warmly. "What else?" "I climbed trees that little girls weren't supposed to climb, asked to help with the planting when I was meant to be learning to sew, and apparently fell in love with dukes who were far above my station." She glanced at him sideways. "Some habits are harder to break than others." "I'm grateful for that particular habit," he said, his voice growing serious. "It's brought you back to me." The words hung between them, heavy with implication. They had been carefully avoiding direct discussion of what was developing between them, dancing around the growing attraction with cautious conversation and meaningful looks. But the pretense was becoming harder to maintain. "Rowan," she said carefully, "what are we doing?" "I wish I knew," he admitted. "I only know that I've thought of nothing else since you walked into my receiving chamber. You've turned my carefully ordered world completely upside down. And Lady Beatrice?" The question escaped before she could stop it, tinged with the jealousy she had been trying to suppress. His expression grew troubled. "Lady Beatrice she's everything she should be. Kind, accomplished, well-bred. Her marriage would be politically advantageous for both our families. But," Catrin prompted when he fell silent, "but when I'm with her, I feel nothing beyond polite affection," he said quietly. "When I'm with you, I feel alive, as if I've been sleepwalking through my life until now." The admission sent a thrill through her, followed immediately by a stab of guilt. Lady Beatrice was an innocent in all this, a woman who deserved better than a suitor, whose heart was engaged elsewhere. "This is impossible," Catrin said, voicing the truth they both knew. "Even if your feelings are genuine, even if mine are equally strong, there's no future for us. You know that as well as I do I?" Rowan turned to face her fully, his brown eyes intense. "Are you so certain that love cannot find a way?" "I'm certain that social barriers exist for reasons," she replied, though her voice lacked conviction. "I'm certain that a duke who marries a peasant woman risks more than his own happiness. He risks the stability of his entire duchy." "You sound like Aldrich." "Perhaps Lord Aldrich has valid concerns." Rowan was quiet for a moment, clearly struggling with his own thoughts. When he spoke again, his voice was low and urgent. "Catrin, I've spent 12 years doing my duty, putting the needs of the duchy before my own desires, making every decision based on political necessity rather than personal feeling. I've been a good duke, I think, but I've been a lonely man." He reached out and took her hand, his fingers warm and strong around hers. "For the first time in my adult life, I've found someone who makes me want to be more than just a title and a set of obligations. Someone who sees the man beneath the duke. Can you understand why I'm reluctant to let that go?" His touch sent warmth racing up her arm, and she found herself caught between desire and wisdom, between the woman who loved him and the practical peasant who understood the impossibility of their situation. "I understand," she said softly. "But understanding and wisdom aren't always the same thing." Before he could respond, the sound of hoofbeats echoed across the meadow. They sprang apart, suddenly aware of how compromising their position might appear, and Catrin felt her heart hammering with fear of discovery. The rider appeared at the edge of the grove, one of the manor guards, mounted on a bay gelding and clearly searching for something. "Or someone. Your Grace," the guard called when he spotted Rowan. "Lord Aldrich requests your immediate return. Lady Beatrice has arrived unexpectedly and waits in the blue salon." "Of course she has," Rowan muttered under his breath, but aloud he said, "Thank you, Marcus. Tell Lord Aldrich I'll return within the quarter hour." The guard bowed from his saddle and rode away, leaving them alone again, but acutely aware of how close they had come to disaster. If the guard had arrived a few moments earlier, while Rowan was holding her hand, while they were speaking so intimately. "I should go," Catrin said, rising quickly. This was foolish. We were nearly— Catrin, wait, but she was already walking away, her mind racing with the implications of what had almost happened. The guard's arrival felt like a warning, a reminder of the dangerous game they were playing and the potential consequences for both of them. As she hurried home through the gathering dusk, Thomas's parting words echoed in her mind. "The path you're walking, it's dangerous." He was right, of course. Every meeting with Rowan increased the risk of discovery, of scandal, of consequences that would destroy far more than just her own reputation. But even knowing that, even understanding the futility of their situation, she knew she would answer if he called for her again, because sometimes the heart refused to listen to wisdom, and sometimes love felt worth the risk of everything. The ancient marriage contract lay spread across Lord Aldrich's desk like a chain of parchment and ink, its formal language binding two great houses in alliance through the union of their children. Duke Rowan stared at the document, its elaborate seals and careful penmanship representing months of negotiation between the Highmere and Thornfield families, and felt the weight of inevitability settling on his shoulders like a mantle of lead. "Lord Thornfield grows impatient," Aldrich said, his voice carrying the careful neutrality he employed when delivering unwelcome news. "3 times in the past month, Lady Beatrice has made the journey here for what she rightfully believes are formal courtship visits. Yet you have made no move toward proposing marriage." Rowan continued studying the contract, noting the precise terms that would govern his future, the dowry arrangements, the territorial agreements, the carefully negotiated clauses that would unite two ducal houses against common enemies. It was a masterpiece of political strategy, beneficial to both parties in every measurable way. "Furthermore," Aldrich continued, "there are reports from the northern borders that Lord Howick has been making overtures to the mercenary companies in Vailshire. If he moves against our eastern holdings, we will need the Thornfield alliance more than ever." The political reality was undeniable. Lord Howick had been testing the boundaries of neighbouring duchies for 2 years, probing for weaknesses, building alliances of his own. A marriage between Rowan and Lady Beatrice would create a formidable coalition, with combined resources that could discourage Howick's aggression and secure the region's stability for a generation. "I understand the strategic value of this alliance," Rowan said finally, his eyes still on the contract. "But surely Lord Thornfield can be patient a few weeks longer." "I would prefer not to rush into such a momentous decision." Aldrich's expression grew troubled. "Rowan, may I speak plainly? Have you ever done otherwise? Your reluctance to proceed with this betrothal has not gone unnoticed. There are whispers among the noble families that you are distracted by other concerns. Some even suggest that your affections lie elsewhere." The words hit their mark, and Rowan felt his chest tighten with apprehension. "What sort of whispers?" "Nothing specific yet," Aldrich said carefully. "But your behavior has changed markedly in recent weeks. You're distracted during council meetings, absent from social functions, and I'm told you've been seen riding alone in the Eastern Meadows with unusual frequency." The Eastern Meadows, where the old mill stood, where he had been meeting Catrin in secret. Rowan forced his expression to remain neutral, but internally he felt the cold touch of exposure. "Perhaps I simply require solitude to contemplate such an important decision," he said evenly. "Perhaps," Aldrich agreed, though his tone suggested skepticism. "But solitude and avoidance are not the same thing. Lady Beatrice deserves better than a suitor who seems reluctant to spend time in her company." The rebuke was gentle but pointed, and Rowan knew it was deserved. Lady Beatrice had been nothing but gracious during her visits, displaying the intelligence, dignity, and warmth that would make her an ideal duchess. She deserved a husband who could appreciate those qualities, not one whose thoughts wandered to another woman during every conversation. "I will make more effort to be attentive during her visits," Rowan said, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. That would be wise. But Rowan, Aldrich leaned forward, his pale eyes serious. It would be even wiser to address whatever is causing your distraction. If there is someone else occupying your thoughts, someone who cannot offer what this alliance provides, then perhaps it's time to end that complication. The conversation was interrupted by a knock at the study door. A servant entered with the announcement that Lady Beatrice had arrived for her afternoon appointment, and Rowan felt his stomach clench with guilt and reluctance. "Send word that I'll join her in the garden pavilion within the quarter hour," he instructed, then turned back to Aldrich. "Have the marriage contract prepared for my signature. I'll review it this evening." Aldrich's relief was visible. "Very good, Your Grace. I believe this decision will serve the duchy well." But as Rowan made his way through the manor corridors toward his meeting with Lady Beatrice, he felt nothing resembling satisfaction or anticipation. Instead, there was only the hollow sense of a man walking toward his own execution. He found Lady Beatrice in the garden pavilion, seated on a stone bench and sketching the late roses that still bloomed despite the advancing autumn. She looked up as he approached, her smile genuine and welcoming, and he was struck anew by her beauty. She was perhaps 23, with auburn hair that caught the afternoon light and intelligent hazel eyes that missed very little. Her dress was elegantly simple, in the deep green that complemented her coloring, and she moved with the natural grace of a woman raised to nobility. She was, by any objective measure, perfect for him, Your Grace, she said, rising with a graceful curtsy. "Thank you for making time to see me. I know your duties keep you constantly occupied. Please sit," he said, settling beside her on the bench and noting the careful distance she maintained, proper and respectful as always. "I hope the journey from Thornfield was pleasant?" "Very much so. The autumn colors are particularly lovely this year." She closed her sketchbook and folded her hands in her lap. "I've brought news from my father. He's received favorable responses from the grain merchants in Westport regarding the new trade agreements we discussed." The conversation that followed was everything such discussions should be: intelligent, productive, focused on matters of mutual benefit to their respective houses. Lady Beatrice was well informed about trade routes and agricultural policy, offered thoughtful suggestions about diplomatic initiatives, and demonstrated exactly the kind of partnership that would strengthen both their positions. She was also clearly expecting a proposal. Rowan could see it in the way she glanced at him when she thought he wasn't looking, in the subtle tension that suggested she was waiting for him to broach a more personal topic. Her father had undoubtedly told her that this visit would likely result in a formal betrothal announcement, and her manner suggested nervous anticipation mixed with genuine affection. "Lady Beatrice," he said when their discussion of trade matters had concluded, "I hope you know how much I value your counsel and your family's friendship." "As I value yours," she replied. But something in her tone suggested she sensed a qualification coming. "I wonder—" He struggled for words that would be honest without being cruel. "I wonder if you are entirely happy with the arrangements being negotiated between our families." The question surprised her, and for a moment her careful composure slipped. "I'm not certain I understand your meaning. Marriage is a significant step," he said carefully. "I would not want you to feel pressured into an arrangement that doesn't suit your own preferences." Lady Beatrice was quiet for a long moment, studying his face with those perceptive hazel eyes. When she spoke, her voice was gentler than before. "May I be frank, Your Grace? I would welcome it. You are asking whether I wish to marry you, but I suspect the more important question is whether you wish to marry me." She paused, then continued with remarkable directness. "Your behavior suggests a man who is conflicted about his future." The observation was so accurate that Rowan felt heat rise in his cheeks. "I apologize if I've seemed less than enthusiastic. The weight of such decisions—" "It's not the weight of decision that troubles you," Lady Beatrice interrupted gently. "It's the weight of duty conflicting with personal inclination." They sat in silence for a moment, both recognizing that they had moved beyond the careful politeness that usually governed such conversations. "You're very perceptive," Rowan said finally. "It comes from watching people carefully," she replied, "and from having some experience with duty conflicting with desire." The admission surprised him. "You speak from experience?" Lady Beatrice smiled ruefully. "Did you think I had no feelings of my own? No preferences or dreams that might not align perfectly with my father's political ambitions? I hadn't considered it," he admitted, realizing how selfish his focus on his own internal conflict had been. "There was someone," she said quietly, gazing out at the garden rather than meeting his eyes. "A young knight in my father's service. Honorable, brave, but unfortunately the second son of a minor lord. Hardly suitable for a duke's daughter. What happened to him?" "He was transferred to a post in the far northern provinces. For his own good, of course, and mine." Her smile held no bitterness, only resignation. "Duty prevailed, as it usually does. Do you regret that decision?" "Sometimes," she said honestly. "But I also understand why it was necessary. Personal feelings, however strong, cannot always take precedence over family obligations and political necessity." The words echoed Aldrich's argument so perfectly that Rowan wondered if this conversation was entirely spontaneous. "And now?" he asked. "Knowing what you've sacrificed for duty, how do you feel about our proposed union?" Lady Beatrice turned to look at him directly, her hazel eyes clear and honest. "I feel that we could build a good partnership, even if it doesn't begin with passionate love. Respect and shared goals can be strong foundations for marriage, but only if both parties are fully committed to making it work." The emphasis on the last phrase was unmistakable. "You deserve better than a husband whose heart lies elsewhere." Rowan said quietly. "Yes," she agreed simply, "I do. Just as you deserve the freedom to pursue your own happiness, if such pursuit is possible without destroying everything you've worked to build." They sat in companionable silence. Two people trapped by the same constraints, understanding each other perhaps better than they ever had before. "What do you suggest?" he asked finally. "I suggest honesty," Lady Beatrice said, rising from the bench. "With yourself, with me, and with whoever it is that has captured your attention. Decide what you truly want, Your Grace, and then have the courage to pursue it. But decide soon. Uncertainty serves no one, least of all the people who depend on your leadership." After she left, Rowan remained in the garden pavilion as the afternoon shadows lengthened around him. Lady Beatrice's words had clarified his situation with uncomfortable precision. He could not continue to avoid decision while both women remained in limbo, hoping for something he had not yet chosen to offer. But even as he acknowledged the truth of her assessment, his thoughts turned inevitably toward Catrin. Tomorrow was the day they had planned to meet again, and despite every rational argument for ending their secret encounters, he knew he would be at the old mill when the appointed time arrived. That evening, he found himself walking through the manor's halls, noting the portraits of his ancestors that lined the corridors. Generations of dukes who had married for alliance, who had chosen duty over personal desire, who had built the stability and prosperity he had inherited. Their painted eyes seemed to watch him with expectation, reminding him that his choices would affect not only his own life, but the lives of thousands who depended on the duchy's strength. In his study, he took out his private journal and wrote, "Lady Beatrice spoke today with a wisdom and honesty that shamed my own evasions. She knows, without my saying so, that my heart lies elsewhere, and she deserves better than the half-attention I have been giving to our courtship. She also deserves better than to be kept waiting while I wrestle with impossible choices. The political situation grows more pressing daily. Aldrich's sources suggest that Lord Harwick may move against us within the year. The Thornfield alliance could mean the difference between security and vulnerability for everyone who looks to me for protection. And yet, when I think of signing that marriage contract, of binding myself to a future that excludes the one person who makes me feel truly alive, I feel as though I'm committing a form of suicide. Tomorrow, I meet with Catrin again. Perhaps it is time to be honest with her as well, to explain the full weight of what I am facing and discover whether Love truly can find a way through seemingly impossible circumstances. Or perhaps it is time to say goodbye. He closed the journal and stared out his window toward the village lights, twinkling in the distance. Somewhere down there, Catrin was probably preparing for bed, perhaps holding the smooth river stone he had given her so many years ago. Perhaps wondering if their secret meetings were worth the risk to both of them. Tomorrow, he would have to find the courage to answer that question. One way or another, the marriage contract lay on his desk where Aldrich had left it, waiting for his signature, ready to secure his future and the duchy's prosperity. All he had to do was pick up his pen and sign his name, and the matter would be settled forever. But first, he had one more conversation to have with a peasant woman who had been carrying his promise for 12 years. First, he had to discover whether some promises were worth breaking a kingdom for. The map spread across Rowan's private study table showed kingdoms and territories that stretched far beyond the familiar borders of his duchy. He traced the trade routes with his finger, following paths that led to distant lands where the rigid social structures of his homeland might hold less sway, where a man might forge his own destiny regardless of the circumstances of his birth. The idea had come to him during a sleepless night spent wrestling with impossible choices. If he could not bring Catrin into his world, perhaps he could enter hers, or better yet, perhaps they could find a third option entirely. The map before him showed possibilities, the free cities of the eastern coast, where merchant princes ruled through wealth rather than bloodline, the frontier territories to the south, where competent men could build their own estates, even the far kingdoms across the sea, where different customs might allow for different choices. It was madness, of course. The idea of a duke renouncing his title, abandoning his people, destroying centuries of careful alliance building for the sake of personal happiness. It was the stuff of ballads and fairy tales, not the sober calculations of responsible leadership. But as dawn broke across his study windows, Rowan found himself making careful notes about trade opportunities in distant kingdoms, about the legal procedures for formally transferring ducal authority to a designated heir, about what assets might be converted to portable wealth for a new life elsewhere. A soft knock interrupted his planning. "Enter," he called, hastily covering the map with other documents. To his surprise, it was not a servant who entered, but his cousin Marcus, a young man of 25 who served as captain of the manor guard. Marcus was the closest thing to a brother Rowan had ever known, having been raised at Highmere after his own father's death in a border skirmish. "Rowan," Marcus said, closing the door behind him with unusual formality. "Forgive the early hour, but there's something we need to discuss. What troubles you?" Marcus approached the desk, his expression serious. "Yesterday, while searching for you at Lord Aldrich's request, I came upon you at the old mill. With a woman." Rowan felt his blood chill. "I see." I recognized her from her visit to the manor, the peasant woman who came about taxation matters. But what I witnessed didn't look like a discussion of village concerns. The accusation hung in the air between them. Marcus was not only family, but also bound by loyalty and affection that went beyond mere duty. If he had chosen to speak privately, rather than report directly to Lord Aldrich, it suggested both discretion and genuine concern. "What did you witness, exactly?" Rowan asked carefully. A man and woman, speaking intimately, sitting close together, looking at each other with obvious affection. Marcus paused. "Rowan, you were holding her hand." There was no point in denial. Marcus had seen what he had seen, and attempting to lie would only insult his intelligence and integrity. "Her name is Catrin," Rowan said quietly. "I knew her as a child, and now?" "Now!" Rowan struggled for words that would explain the inexplicable. "Now I find myself in love with her." Marcus sank into the chair across from the desk, his expression troubled. "Do you understand what you're risking? Not just for yourself, but for everyone who depends on this duchy's stability." "You sound like Aldrich." "Because Aldrich is right, even if his delivery lacks warmth." Marcus leaned forward. "I've watched you struggle with the loneliness of your position. seen you turn away from potential matches that might have brought happiness. I want you to find love, truly I do. But not like this. Why not like this? Because she's a peasant, Rowan. Because Lady Beatrice's father grows impatient and Lord Harwick grows bolder. And because a duke who puts personal desire before political necessity risks losing everything our family has built. The arguments were familiar, but hearing them from Marcus, who had no official responsibility for political strategy, made them somehow more painful. What if I renounced my title? Rowan asked suddenly. What if I formally transferred the duchy to you and left to make a new life elsewhere? Marcus stared at him in shock. You can't be serious. Why not? You're capable. You understand the political situation. You have the respect of the noble families. With the Thornfield alliance secured through your marriage to Lady Beatrice instead of mine, the duchy would be just as well protected. I'm not the rightful heir, Marcus protested. And even if I were, do you think the woman you love would respect a man who abandoned his responsibilities for her sake? Do you think she could live with the knowledge that thousands of people had lost their legitimate ruler because of her? The question struck home with uncomfortable precision. Rowan knew Catrin well enough to understand that her compassionate nature would never allow her to find happiness at such a cost. Then what do you suggest? Rowan asked, frustration bleeding into his voice. That I marry Lady Beatrice and condemn myself to a lifetime of dutiful unhappiness. That I abandon the one woman who makes me feel truly alive for the sake of political convenience. I suggest, Marcus said carefully, that you consider the possibility that some situations have no good solutions. That being a duke sometimes means accepting sacrifice in service of the greater good. Before Rowan could respond, another knock sounded at the door. This time, it was Lord Aldrich himself who entered, his expression grave. Your Grace, I regret the interruption, but there's been a development that requires your immediate attention. What sort of development? I've just received word from one of our contacts in Briarstead village. It seems that Mistress Whitmore's father has approached me through intermediaries, requesting a private audience. Rowan felt his stomach clench with apprehension. Willem Whitmore wants to speak with you? So it appears. The message suggests he has concerns about his daughter's recent activities. I believe he may have discovered her unauthorized visits to the manor grounds. The room fell silent as the implications sank in. If Willem had discovered Catrin's secret meetings, if he chose to make the matter public, the scandal would destroy not only her reputation, but potentially Rowan's political position as well. When does he wish to meet? Rowan asked. This afternoon, if convenient. Aldrich paused. Your Grace, I strongly recommend that you allow me to handle this matter privately. Willem Whitmore is a reasonable man who understands social boundaries. I believe he can be persuaded to ensure his daughter's discretion in exchange for certain considerations. What sort of considerations? A generous settlement, perhaps relocation to another village where the family can begin fresh without the burden of local gossip. The resources to establish a better farm, ensure Catrin's comfortable marriage to an appropriate suitor. The clinical nature of the proposal made Rowan feel sick. Aldrich was discussing Catrin's future as if she were a problem to be solved, rather than a person with her own desires and agency. You would buy her silence, Rowan said flatly. I would protect the duchy's stability and the young woman's reputation simultaneously, Aldrich corrected. Surely you see the wisdom in preventing a scandal before it can develop. And if I refuse to allow such a transaction? Aldrich's expression grew stern. Then I would be forced to consider more direct measures to protect the duchy's interests. The threat was politely phrased, but unmistakable. Rowan felt a surge of anger at the idea of Catrin being manipulated or coerced. But he also recognized the political realities that drove Aldrich's calculations. After both men left, Rowan sat alone in his study, staring at the covered map that represented impossible dreams and the marriage contract that represented inescapable duty. The walls of his carefully ordered life were closing in from all sides. leaving him with choices that seemed to offer only different forms of loss. That afternoon, he made his way to the old mill with a heavy heart, knowing that this meeting with Catrin would be different from all the others. The time for gentle conversation and careful avoidance of difficult topics had passed. Now they faced the stark reality of their situation and the limited options remaining to them. She was waiting for him by the stream, her beauty enhanced by the golden afternoon light, but her expression troubled. She must have sensed the change in him immediately, because she spoke before he could find the words. "Something's wrong," she said simply. "Everything's wrong," he replied, and the honesty in his voice seemed to pain them both. They walked to their usual secluded spot, but instead of the easy conversation that typically marked their meetings, they stood facing each other with the weight of unspoken truths between them. "My father knows," Catrin said suddenly, "about our meetings. He hasn't said anything directly, but I can see it in his eyes, in the way he watches me. It's only a matter of time before he acts on his suspicions." "Aldrich knows as well," Rowan admitted. "He's planning to approach your father this afternoon, to offer your family incentives for discretion and relocation." Relocation. The word came out as barely a whisper. "To another village where the scandal won't follow you, along with enough resources to ensure your comfortable marriage to a suitable husband." Catrin was quiet for a long moment, absorbing the implications. When she spoke, her voice was steady but sad. "So they mean to solve the problem by removing me from it." "I won't let that happen," Rowan said fiercely. "I won't let them buy and sell your future as if you were property to be traded." "Then what alternative do you propose?" she asked gently. "Because I can see in your eyes that you've been wrestling with solutions, and I suspect you found them as impossible as I have." He wanted to tell her about the maps, about the distant kingdoms where they might build a life together. But Marcus's words echoed in his mind. Would she respect a man who abandoned his responsibilities for her sake? Instead, he found himself moving closer, drawn by the need to touch her, to feel some connection that transcended the barriers being erected around them. She didn't pull away when he reached for her hands, didn't resist when he drew her closer still. "Catrin," he said, her name a prayer on his lips. "Whatever happens, you must know that these past weeks have been the most alive I've felt in years. You've given me a glimpse of what love could be, and I'll carry that with me no matter where our paths lead." "Rowan," she whispered, and there were tears in her eyes now. "I've loved you since I was 10 years old, and I'll love you until the day I die. But I won't be the reason you destroy everything you've worked to build." The kiss that followed was desperate and sweet, filled with all the longing they had been carefully suppressing, and the knowledge that their time was running out. When they finally parted, both were breathing hard and fighting back tears. "What do we do?" she asked, and he heard in her voice the same desperate need for solutions that had driven him to study maps of distant kingdoms. "I don't know," he admitted, "but I'm not ready to say goodbye." Not yet. They made plans to meet once more in 3 days' time, after the confrontation with their respective guardians had played out. It would be dangerous, perhaps foolhardy, but neither could bear the thought of ending things without one final conversation. As they parted, Rowan felt as though he were watching his future walk away from him. The woman he loved was returning to a cottage, where her father would soon be pressured to accept bribes for her silence and relocation. Meanwhile, he would return to a manor where a marriage contract waited for his signature and a political alliance hung in the balance. The map in his study offered theoretical escape, but the practical obstacles seemed insurmountable. Yet as he watched Catrin disappear into the evening shadows, Rowan knew that he wasn't ready to accept defeat. Not yet. Some dreams were worth fighting for, even when the odds seemed impossible. Some promises were worth keeping, even when keeping them required sacrificing everything else. In 3 days, they would meet again, and perhaps in those 3 days, one of them would find the courage to choose love over duty, regardless of the consequences. Perhaps. The cottage had never felt so small or so heavy with unspoken words. Catrin sat beside her grandmother's bed, holding Marta's weathered hand, while the old woman drifted between sleep and waking. Her breathing labored from the fever that had taken hold 3 days ago. The village healer had done what she could, but at 73, Marta's body was fighting a battle it might not win. Willem sat in the corner, his face drawn with worry and something else. A tension that had nothing to do with his mother's illness and everything to do with the conversation he had avoided having with his daughter. But Catrin could feel the weight of his knowledge in every glance, every carefully neutral comment about her whereabouts. "Father," she said softly, not wanting to wake Marta but needing to address the silence that had stretched between them. "I know you have questions." Willem looked up from his hands, his eyes tired but not unkind. "Questions, yes. And fears about what you suspect I've been doing, about what I know you've been doing," he corrected gently. "A man doesn't raise a daughter for 22 years without learning to read her moods, her absences, her sudden tendency to stare at the manor road as if expecting someone." Marta stirred at the sound of their voices, her blue eyes opening slowly. Despite her illness, there was still sharpness in her gaze as she looked between father and daughter. "Stop dancing around the truth like nervous children," she said, her voice hoarse but firm. "Willem, your daughter has been meeting with the Duke. Catrin, your father has been approached by Lord Aldrich about ending those meetings. There, now we can speak plainly." The blunt statement hung in the air like a challenge. Catrin felt her cheeks warm, but she also felt a strange relief at having the truth finally spoken aloud. "Grandmother, don't grandmother me, child. I may be dying, but I'm not blind." Marta struggled to sit up straighter, waving away Willem's attempt to help her. "The question is what we do about it. Lord Aldrich has made his intentions clear," Willem said heavily. "He's offered generous compensation for our family's relocation to a distant village, along with resources to establish Catrin in a suitable marriage. The alternative, he suggested, might be less pleasant. They mean to buy our silence and remove the problem," Catrin said bitterly. "As if I were a piece of merchandise to be traded away." "You're a peasant woman in love with a duke," Willem replied, not unkindly but with brutal honesty. "From their perspective, you are exactly that, a complication to be resolved." Marta was quiet for a moment, studying them both with eyes that seemed to see more than they revealed. Then she spoke in a voice that was weak but determined. "Willem, help me to the chest in the corner. There's something Catrin needs to see. Mother, you should rest. I'll rest when I'm dead, which may be sooner than later. Help me up." With reluctant assistance, Marta made her way to an old wooden chest that had sat in the corner of the cottage for as long as Catrin could remember. It was a simple piece, unremarkable save for its obvious age and the careful way Marta had always treated it. Now, with hands that shook from more than illness, she lifted the heavy lid. Inside, beneath layers of carefully preserved cloth, lay treasures that took Catrin's breath away. There was jewelry. Not the simple pieces a farmer's wife might own, but elegant work in silver and pearls that spoke of wealth and refined taste. There were documents tied with ribbon, their parchment bearing official seals, and at the very bottom, wrapped in silk that had once been white but had yellowed with age, lay a dress of such fine fabric and exquisite workmanship that it could only have belonged to nobility. "Grandmother," Catrin whispered, "what is all this?" Marta lifted one of the documents with trembling fingers, unfolding it to reveal careful script and an elaborate seal. "This is a marriage certificate dated 25 years ago, between Willem Whitmore, farmer of Briarstead, and Lady Catrin Elizabeth of Westmarch." The words hit Catrin like a physical blow. She stared at the parchment, trying to process what her grandmother was telling her. "My mother was..." Lady Catrin was... "Your mother was the daughter of Lord Edmund of Westmarch," Marta said gently. "Third daughter of a minor but legitimate noble house, with bloodlines that trace back to the founding of the kingdom." Willem's face had gone pale. "Mother, you swore you would never..." "I swore I would keep the secret until it was needed," Marta interrupted. "Well, it's needed now." Catrin sank onto a stool beside the chest, her mind reeling. "But how? Why? If she was nobility, how did she come to marry a farmer?" "Because she fell in love," Marta said simply. Catrin was promised to a lord twice her age, a political alliance that would have benefited her family but condemned her to misery. So she ran away, came to Briarstead under an assumed name, met your father at the harvest festival, and chose love over duty, just as her daughter is doing now, Willem added quietly. The marriage was performed in secret by Father Marcus, the old priest, not the current one, with myself and 2 others as witnesses. Catrin gave up her title, her inheritance, everything that marked her as nobility. She became simply Catrin Whitmore, farmer's wife. Catrin picked up one of the other documents, noting the official seals and formal language. Oh, what are these? Birth records, lineage documents, proof of Catherine's noble blood. Marta coughed, the sound harsh in the small room. Your mother made me promise to keep them safe in case someday they might matter. They matter now, Willem said, understanding dawning in his voice. If Catrin has noble blood, even diluted by her common father's line, she might be considered eligible for marriage to a duke, Marta finished. Not ideal from a political standpoint, but legally permissible under kingdom law. The silence that followed was profound. Catrin stared at the documents in her hands, trying to reconcile this revelation with everything she had believed about herself and her place in the world. She was not simply a peasant woman in love with someone far above her station. She was the daughter of a runaway noble with legitimate claim to gentle birth. Why didn't you tell me? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Because your mother made me promise not to, unless the knowledge became necessary for your happiness or safety, Marta replied. She wanted you to grow up free from the burdens of nobility, free to choose your own path. But she also wanted you to have options if you ever needed them. And now I need them. Now you need them, Marta agreed. Willem moved to kneel beside his daughter, taking her hands in his work-roughened ones. Catrin, you must understand. This changes everything and nothing. Yes, you have noble blood, but you're also the daughter of a farmer, raised in humble circumstances. The noble families may not accept you easily, but they couldn't legally object to the match, Catrin said, beginning to see the possibilities. If the bloodline is legitimate, if the documentation is sound, there would still be challenges, Willem cautioned. Investigation of the claims, verification of the lineage, political negotiations. And that assumes Duke Rowan chooses to pursue this path rather than the safer alliance with Lady Beatrice. He would need to know, Catrin said, looking between her father and grandmother. About all of this, he would need to decide if he's willing to fight for a future that's possible but not certain, rather than accepting one that's guaranteed but unwanted. Marta reached for her granddaughter's hand, her grip surprisingly strong despite her illness. There's something else you need to understand, child. If you choose this path, there's no going back to the simple life you've known. Noble blood carries obligations and expectations just as binding as a duke's crown. You would be trading one set of constraints for another, but they would be constraints I choose with the man I love, Catrin replied, rather than constraints imposed by others' political calculations. Yes, Marta said with a small smile. Rather like your mother's choice all those years ago. As the implications of this revelation settled over them, Catrin felt a strange mixture of hope and terror. The impossible had suddenly become merely difficult. The insurmountable barriers had been reduced to challenging obstacles. But with possibility came responsibility. To her mother's memory, to her father's sacrifices, to the man she loved, and to the future they might now be able to build together. What happens now? Willem asked. Catrin looked at the documents spread before her, tangible proof of a heritage she had never known she possessed. Tomorrow was the day she had planned to meet Rowan, for what they both believed would be their final goodbye. Instead, she would bring him news that could change everything if he had the courage to seize it. Now I tell him the truth, she said. All of it. About my mother, about these documents, about the possibility that we might find a way to be together, after all. And then we discover whether love can overcome not just social barriers, but the fear of taking a chance on an uncertain future. Outside the cottage, the sun, was setting over the fields of Briarstead, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. Somewhere up the hill, in the great manor house, a duke was wrestling with impossible choices and the weight of duty. Soon he would learn that the woman he loved was not who either of them had believed her to be. Soon they would both discover whether some revelations came too late to matter, or just in time to change everything. The hidden documents lay on the simple wooden table like instruments of fate, waiting to reshape the destiny of two hearts that had found each other across the greatest divide their world could offer. Tomorrow would bring answers. Tonight, there was only the hope that love, given a chance, might prove stronger than all the forces arrayed against it. The faded wedding ring lay in Willem's palm like a circle of destiny, its simple silver band worn smooth by 25 years of secret keeping. He had found it among his late wife's most precious possessions the night after Marta's revelation, wrapped in the same piece of silk that had preserved her wedding dress. It was the final piece of evidence they needed, tangible proof that Lady Catrin of Westmarch had indeed married beneath her station for love. She never took it off, not even when we had to pretend to be merely common folk, Willem said softly, his weathered fingers tracing the delicate engraving on the band. Every night before sleep, she would hold it and tell me stories of her childhood at Westmarch, the gardens she tended, the books she read, the dreams she abandoned to choose me. Catrin sat across from her father at their small kitchen table, the collection of documents spread between them like pieces of a puzzle that could reshape both their lives. 3 days had passed since Marta's revelation, 3 sleepless nights spent verifying what they could and preparing for what might come. Her grandmother's fever had broken, but the old woman remained weak, as if the effort of sharing her long-held secret had drained what little strength remained to her. "Tell me again about the chapel," Catrin said, studying the marriage certificate for what felt like the 100th time. "The one where they were wed, St. Bridget's, in the hills above Millbrook village, perhaps a day's ride from here. Father Marcus, the old priest, not his successor, performed the ceremony in secret. Your mother insisted on having proper witnesses despite the danger. There was myself, of course, and Thomas Crane the miller, and Sarah Fletcher, Eleanor Fletcher's late sister-in-law. Sarah Fletcher died 3 winters past," Catrin said, worry creeping into her voice. "Thomas Crane moved to the coastal villages years ago, but Eleanor Fletcher remains, and she knows the truth of it. Sarah confided in her before she died, worried that the secret might die with her." Willem paused. "And Father Marcus still lives, though he's retired now to a cottage near the old chapel. If anyone could verify the legitimacy of the ceremony, it would be he." The prospect of gathering witness testimony filled Catrin with equal measures of hope and apprehension. Each person they approached would need to understand the magnitude of what they were revealing, that a duke's potential bride was not the simple peasant she appeared to be, but the daughter of noble blood who had been raised in humble circumstances. "Father," she said carefully, "are you truly prepared for what this might mean? If we can prove my mother's lineage, if Duke Rowan chooses to pursue a marriage based on these revelations, everything will change. The quiet life you've built here, the peace you found after Mother's death, it will all be disrupted." Willem was quiet for a long moment, staring down at his wife's wedding ring. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of years spent carrying secrets and the love of a man who had watched his daughter struggle with impossible dreams. "Catrin, for 22 years, I've watched you carry that stone the Duke gave you as a child. I've seen you turn away good men because your heart was elsewhere, seen you stare at the manor road with the same expression your mother wore when she spoke of the life she'd given up for love. If there's a chance, any chance, that you might find the happiness she found with me, then yes, I'm prepared for the consequences." His words brought tears to her eyes. But before she could respond, a knock sounded at their cottage door. Through the small window, Catrin could see a figure in the blue and silver livery of Highmere Manor, a messenger, no doubt carrying word from Lord Aldrich about their relocation arrangements. Willem rose to answer, and Catrin heard the brief exchange of formal pleasantries before he returned with a sealed letter. But when he broke the ducal seal, his expression shifted from resignation to surprise. "It's not from Lord Aldrich," he said. "It's from Duke Rowan himself. He requests a private meeting with you this afternoon, not at the mill, but at the chapel ruins on Blackberry Hill." Catrin felt her pulse quicken. The chapel ruins were farther from the manor than their usual meeting places, more secluded but also more dangerous if they were discovered. That Rowan had chosen such a location suggested he understood the gravity of whatever conversation awaited them. "I should go with you," Willem said. But Catrin shook her head. "This is something I need to do alone." "But father—" She gathered the documents carefully, wrapping them in oiled cloth to protect against the autumn dampness. "If something happens to me, if this goes wrong and I don't return, promise me you'll take these to Father Marcus yourself. Let him decide whether the truth should be preserved for future generations." "Nothing will happen to you," Willem said firmly, but he helped her secure the precious papers in a leather satchel that had belonged to her mother. "But yes, I promise." The ride to Blackberry Hill took Catrin through countryside she had known all her life, but today every familiar landmark seemed charged with significance. She was no longer simply a peasant woman riding to meet her forbidden lover. She was Lady Catherine's daughter, carrying proof of noble heritage that could legitimize what had seemed impossible just days before. The chapel ruins sat atop the hill, like broken teeth against the autumn sky. Stones that had once sheltered centuries of worship, now providing only partial walls and the suggestion of what had been. Rowan was already there, standing among the fallen stones, with his back to the approach path, his shoulders set with the kind of tension that spoke of momentous decisions. He turned as she approached, and she saw immediately that something had changed. His face carried new lines of strain, and his eyes held the hollow look of a man who had been pushed beyond his limits. "Catrin," he said, and there was relief in his voice at seeing her. "I wasn't certain you would come. I gave my word," she replied, dismounting and securing her horse to a stunted tree. "Though I confess your choice of meeting place suggests this conversation may be different from our others." "Everything is different," Rowan said quietly. "The situation has escalated beyond what either of us anticipated." They found a sheltered spot among the ruins where fallen stones created a natural seat. But instead of the easy intimacy that had marked their previous meetings, there was a formality between them now, the careful distance of two people who understood they were about to make decisions that would affect far more than their personal happiness. "Tell me what's happened," Catrin said. Rowan was quiet for a moment, gathering his thoughts. "Lord Aldrich has accelerated his timeline. Lady Beatrice's father has given me until the end of this week to formally announce our betrothal, or he'll consider our negotiations ended and pursue other alliances. Meanwhile, Lord Harwick's forces have been spotted within a day's march of our eastern borders. Not yet an invasion, but a clear provocation. And the pressure on my family? Aldrich has been persistent in his offers to relocate you. When your father didn't respond immediately, he suggested that continued resistance might necessitate more direct intervention." Rowan's jaw tightened. He stopped just short of threats, but the implication was clear. Catrin felt a chill that had nothing to do with the autumn wind. "How direct?" "Accusations of improper conduct. Charges that could result in your family losing your farm, perhaps even imprisonment if he chose to press them." Rowan looked at her directly. "I won't let that happen. Whatever the cost to myself or my position, I won't allow innocent people to suffer for my failings." "Your failings?" The words came out sharper than she intended. "Rowan, what we've shared these past weeks, whatever mistakes we may have made in pursuing it, whatever risks we've taken, none of it has been failure. It's been the most honest, most beautiful part of both our lives. Beautiful, yes," he agreed sadly, "but ultimately impossible. I've spent 3 sleepless nights trying to find a solution, some way we could be together without destroying everything else. I've considered renouncing my title, fleeing to distant kingdoms, even challenging the social conventions that keep us apart. But every path leads to the same conclusion, which is that love, however strong, cannot overcome the fundamental realities of our positions. That a duke who puts personal desire before political necessity fails not only himself, but everyone who depends on his leadership. The defeat in his voice was painful to hear, but Catrin felt a spark of hope that he hadn't yet seen what she carried in her satchel. "Rowan," she said gently, "what if the fundamental realities weren't what we believed them to be?" "What do you mean?" "What if there were another way? Not perfect, not without challenges, but legally possible and politically defensible?" She reached for the leather satchel, her fingers trembling slightly as she untied the leather cords. 3 days ago, my grandmother revealed a secret she's carried for over 20 years. A secret about my mother, about our family, about who I really am. Rowan's expression shifted from resignation to curiosity as she withdrew the oiled cloth bundle and began to unwrap the precious documents. "My mother wasn't born. Catherine Whitmore," Catrin said, spreading the marriage certificate across her lap, where he could see the official seals and formal language. "She was born Lady Catherine Elizabeth of Westmarch, third daughter of Lord Edmund. She ran away from an arranged marriage to choose love with a common farmer. But she never renounced her noble blood." Rowan stared at the document, his eyes moving from the elaborate seals to the careful script that recorded the union between nobleman's daughter and peasant farmer. "Which means," Catrin continued, "that I am not simply a peasant woman who fell in love above her station. I am the daughter of legitimate noble blood, diluted by my father's common birth, yes, but legally sufficient to make marriage to a duke possible under kingdom law." The silence that followed was profound. Rowan lifted the marriage certificate with careful hands, studying every detail as if looking for flaws in what seemed too good to be true. "The documentation would need verification," he said finally, his voice carefully controlled. "Investigation of the lineage, testimony from witnesses, formal recognition by the royal court, all of which could be arranged if you're willing to fight for it," Catrin said. "Father Marcus, who performed the ceremony, still lives. Eleanor Fletcher can testify to what her sister-in-law confided before her death. The church records at St. Bridget's should corroborate the marriage certificate, and if the documentation proves genuine, if the lineage is verified and the noble blood confirmed, then Lady Beatrice's father would have no legal grounds to object to your choice of bride. Lord Aldrich's political concerns would be addressed, perhaps not as completely as with the Thornfield alliance, but sufficiently to maintain the duchy's stability. And we would have a chance," Rowan finished, wonder creeping into his voice. "We would have a chance," she confirmed. They sat among the ruins of the ancient chapel, holding between them the proof that their impossible love might be possible after all. But even as hope bloomed in Catrin's chest, she could see the weight of new concerns settling on Rowan's shoulders. "The challenges would be immense," he said slowly. "Proving the legitimacy of documents that have been hidden for decades, convincing noble families to accept a duke's bride who was raised as a peasant, managing the political implications of choosing an unknown quantity over an established alliance." "Yes," Catrin agreed. "It would be difficult, uncertain, potentially dangerous for your position and reputation. I'm not asking you to choose the easy path, Rowan. I'm asking if you're willing to choose the possible one." He looked at her then, really looked at her, as if seeing not just the peasant woman he had fallen in love with, but the nobleman's daughter she had always been without knowing it. "The investigation process alone could take weeks," he said. "We would need to move carefully, gather all possible evidence, present a case so solid that even the most traditional nobles couldn't dispute it. Are you willing to try?" The question hung between them, like a bridge across an impossible chasm. On one side lay safety, certainty, the predictable path of political alliance and dutiful marriage. On the other lay risk, uncertainty, and the chance that love might triumph over all the forces arrayed against it. Rowan was quiet for a long moment, staring down at the marriage certificate that had changed everything. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the strength of a man who had found his courage. "Yes," he said simply, "I'm willing to try. For you, for us, for the chance that sometimes impossible dreams prove to be merely improbable ones." The kiss they shared among the chapel ruins was different from any that had come before, not desperate with the knowledge of approaching separation, but filled with hope and determination, and the promise of a future they might actually be able to build together. When they finally parted, both were smiling despite the tears in their eyes. "What happens now?" Catrin asked. "Now we gather every piece of evidence we can find. We verify the documentation, collect witness testimony, build a case so compelling that even Lord Aldrich will have to admit it changes everything. And if we succeed..." "If we succeed," Rowan said, taking her hand in both of his, "then I'll ask you properly, in front of God and witnesses, to be my wife. Not as a duke claiming a peasant woman, but as a man who has found the woman he wants to spend his life with." As they began to plan their campaign to prove Catrin's noble heritage, the faded wedding ring in her pocket seemed to pulse with warmth, a reminder that love had conquered seemingly impossible odds before, and might do so again. The battle for their future was about to begin. The great hall of Westbridge Castle had been transformed into a court of judgment, its ancient stones bearing witness to a proceeding that would determine not just the fate of two hearts, but the legitimacy of a love that had defied every convention of their world. Banners from the kingdom's most prominent noble houses hung from the vaulted ceiling, their colors creating a tapestry of power and tradition that seemed to press down upon those gathered below. At the head of the hall sat Magistrate Sir Edmund Greystone, a man of 60 whose reputation for fairness was matched only by his meticulous attention to legal precedent. To his right and left sat the noble council, lords and ladies whose bloodlines stretched back centuries and whose approval would be necessary to legitimize Catrin's claim to gentle birth. Duke Rowan stood before the assembled court in his finest formal attire, the blue and silver of Hymir blazoned across his chest, but his attention was fixed entirely on the woman beside him. Catrin wore a simple but elegant dress of deep green wool, not the peasant garb of her daily life, but not the elaborate court dress of high nobility either. It was a careful balance, representing the truth of who she was, born to nobility, but raised in humility. "Your Grace," Magistrate Greystone said, his voice carrying clearly through the hall, "you have petitioned this court to recognize the noble heritage of Mistress Catrin Whitmore, daughter of the late Lady Catrin of Westmarch. The implications of this recognition are significant. Should we rule in favor of your petition, it would legitimize your proposed marriage and alter the political landscape of several duchies. Do you understand the gravity of these proceedings?" "I do, Your Honor," Rowan replied, his voice steady despite the tension that Catrin could see in the set of his shoulders. "And you, Mistress Whitmore," the magistrate continued, turning his attention to her, "do you understand that accepting recognition as a member of the nobility carries obligations and responsibilities that extend far beyond your personal circumstances?" Catrin felt the weight of dozens of eyes upon her, lords and ladies who had never seen her before today, who would judge not just her bloodline, but her worthiness to join their ranks. "I understand, Your Honor. Very well. Let us examine the evidence." Lord Aldrich stepped forward, his expression carefully neutral, but his movements precise and formal. Despite his initial opposition to this union, he had thrown himself into building their case, once Rowan made his decision clear. Political wisdom, if not personal preference, dictated that he support his duke completely. "Your Honor, members of the Noble Council," Aldrich began, "I present first the marriage certificate of Lady Catrin Elizabeth of Westmarch and Willem Whitmore, sealed by the Church and witnessed according to proper law. The ancient parchment was brought forward on a silk cushion, its seals and formal script examined closely by the magistrate and several council members. Catrin watched their faces, trying to read approval or skepticism in their expressions. But the trained diplomats revealed nothing. The documentation appears genuine, Magistrate Greystone observed after several minutes of careful study. However, the legitimacy of the marriage ceremony itself requires witness testimony. Who can speak to the circumstances of this union? Willem stepped forward from where he had been waiting with quiet dignity near the back of the hall. At 65, he cut an impressive figure despite his humble origins. Straight-backed, clear-eyed, wearing his finest clothes with the natural confidence of a man who had nothing to hide. "I can speak to it." "Your Honor," he said, his voice carrying the gentle strength that had guided his family through decades of secret-keeping. "I am Willem Whitmore, and Lady Catrin was my beloved wife. Tell us of your courtship and marriage," the magistrate instructed. Willem's testimony unfolded like a story from the ballads, a young noblewoman fleeing an unwanted marriage, finding refuge in a village where she met a farmer who saw her worth beyond her title. He spoke of their secret courtship, of Catherine's decision to renounce her inheritance for love, of the hidden ceremony that bound them together despite the vast difference in their stations. "She never regretted her choice," Willem concluded, his voice soft with memory. "Not once in 22 years of marriage did she express regret for the life she had chosen with me. And you have no doubt that the woman you married was indeed Lady Catrin of Westmarch." "None whatsoever. She bore the Westmarch family ring, knew intimate details of their holdings and history, and carried documents that proved her identity beyond question." Next came Eleanor Fletcher, her weathered hands steady as she swore her oath to speak truth. She testified to the confidences her late sister-in-law had shared, to the secret ceremonies she had witnessed, to the knowledge of noble blood that had been carefully preserved within their village community. "Sarah made me promise," Eleanor said, her voice thick with emotion, "that if anything ever happened to the secret, if it was ever needed to protect young Catrin's future, I would speak the truth of what I knew. But it was the final witness who provided the most compelling testimony. Father Marcus, now 81 and bent with age but still sharp of mind, approached the witness stand with the careful steps of a man carrying the weight of decades. "I performed the marriage ceremony," he said simply when asked to state his knowledge, "in the chapel of St. Brigid, with proper witnesses and according to all requirements of church and civil law. Lady Catrin came to me in tears, carrying documents that proved her identity, begging for help in escaping a marriage that would have been a living death." "And you were satisfied of her identity?" "Completely. I had known her father, Lord Edmund, in my younger days when I served at Westmarch Castle. Catrin was unmistakably his daughter. She had his eyes, his manner of speaking, and knowledge of family matters that no impostor could have possessed." The testimony continued for hours, each witness adding weight to the case that Catrin was indeed the legitimate daughter of noble blood. Documents were examined, genealogies reviewed, and questions posed that tested every aspect of their claims. Through it all, Catrin remained silent, her hand occasionally finding the smooth river stone in her pocket. The token Rowan had given her as a child now carried more for comfort than hope. The outcome of these proceedings would determine whether that childhood promise could finally be fulfilled, or whether even noble blood would prove insufficient to bridge the gaps between their worlds. As the afternoon wore on, she became aware of whispers from the noble gallery, conversations too quiet to follow, but intense enough to suggest that opinion was divided. Some faces showed skepticism, others appeared thoughtful, and a few displayed the kind of calculation that marked political minds assessing new possibilities. Finally, after what felt like an eternity of testimony and examination, Magistrate Greystone called for recess. The noble council withdrew to deliberate, leaving the main participants to wait in agonizing silence. "Whatever they decide," Rowan said quietly, moving to stand beside Catrin as they watched the council file out. "You should know that these past weeks of fighting for us have been the most purposeful of my life. Even if we lose, even then, because at least we tried. At least we chose to fight for love rather than surrender to circumstances. Lord Aldrich approached them, his expression unreadable. "The testimony was strong," he said without preamble. "The documentation appears sound, the witnesses credible. But the council faces a difficult decision, not just about bloodline, but about precedent." "Precedent?" Catrin asked. "If they rule in your favor, they establish that noble blood, however diluted, can legitimize marriages across class boundaries. Other families will reference this case in future disputes. They're not just judging your situation, they're potentially reshaping the social order itself. The weight of that responsibility settled over them like a heavy cloak. They were not simply fighting for their own happiness, but potentially opening doors for others whose love had been thwarted by the accidents of birth." An hour later, the council returned, their faces grave with the weight of decision. Magistrate Greystone took his seat and surveyed the assembled court before speaking. "In the matter of the noble heritage of Catrin Whitmore, we have reached our decision." Catrin felt Rowan's hand find hers, his fingers warm and steady, despite the tremor she could feel in them. This was the moment they had fought for, prepared for, risked everything to achieve. The royal seal waited on the magistrate's desk, either to validate her noble status and legitimize their union, or to condemn their love as legally impossible, despite the evidence they had presented. "Will the parties please rise for the reading of our judgment?" Magistrate Greystone said, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. In the silence that followed, Catrin could hear her own heartbeat. Feel the collective held breath of everyone in the great hall. Everything they had dreamed of, everything they had fought for, came down to the next words from the magistrate's lips. "After careful deliberation and thorough examination of all evidence presented," Magistrate Greystone began, his voice carrying clearly through the silent hall, "this court finds that Catrin Whitmore is indeed the legitimate daughter of Lady Catherine Elizabeth of Westmarch, and therefore possesses noble blood sufficient to make marriage to Duke Rowan of Hymir legally permissible under the laws of this kingdom." The words hung in the air for a moment before their meaning fully registered. Then the great hall erupted, not in chaos, but in the controlled stir of a momentous decision being absorbed by those whose lives it would touch. Catrin felt her knees go weak with relief, and only Rowan's steadying hand prevented her from swaying. "Furthermore," the magistrate continued, raising his voice to quiet the murmurs, "we find that the marriage between Lady Catherine and Willem Whitmore was legitimate and properly witnessed, that their daughter has been raised with the moral character befitting her heritage, and that recognition of her status serves both justice and the interests of the realm." Magistrate Greystone lifted the royal seal of approval, a disc of gold and silver that gleamed in the afternoon light streaming through the tall windows. With deliberate ceremony, he pressed it to the document that would officially recognize Catrin's noble status. "By the authority vested in this court," he declared, "I hereby recognize Catrin Whitmore as Lady Catrin, daughter of the House of Westmarch, with all rights and privileges pertaining thereto." The transformation was instant and profound. She was no longer a peasant woman who had dared to love above her station. She was Lady Catrin, legitimate daughter of noble blood, worthy bride for a duke. The change was not just legal, but social, political, and deeply personal. Rowan turned to face her fully, and in his eyes she saw wonder mixed with joy and something deeper, the recognition that their impossible dream had become reality through courage, truth, and the power of love that refused to surrender to circumstance. Without regard for the watching nobles or court protocol, he dropped to one knee before her, taking her hands in both of his. "Lady Catrin," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the hall, but meant for her alone, "you have been the keeper of my heart since childhood, the woman who has shown me what love truly means. Will you do me the honor of becoming my wife?" Through tears of joy, she looked down at the man she had loved since she was 10 years old, no longer separated from her by insurmountable barriers, no longer constrained by the accidents of birth that had seemed to make their union impossible. "Yes," she said simply, the word containing 22 years of dreams, weeks of struggle, and the promise of a future they could finally build together. "Yes, I will marry you." The kiss that followed was witnessed by the assembled nobility of the kingdom. But neither Rowan nor Catrin was aware of anything beyond the simple joy of loving freely and openly for the first time in their lives. When they finally parted, the great hall had erupted in genuine celebration. Even those nobles who had been skeptical of the proceedings seemed caught up in the romance of the moment, the childhood promise kept, the love that had survived years of separation and weeks of seemingly impossible obstacles. But it was the approach of Lady Beatrice that truly marked the magnitude of what had occurred. She had been present throughout the proceedings, sitting with quiet dignity in the gallery reserved for interested parties. And now she came forward with a smile that held no trace of bitterness or resentment. "Your Grace," she said to Rowan with a graceful curtsy, then turned to Catrin with equal respect. "Lady Catrin, please accept my congratulations on your recognition and your betrothal." "Lady Beatrice," Catrin began, but the other woman raised a gentle hand. "There is nothing to apologize for," Beatrice said warmly. "I told you once that we both deserved to marry for love rather than mere convenience. Today you have achieved that dream. I pray that I may find the same happiness in my own time." The gracious blessing from the woman who might have been Rowan's bride served as a benediction on their union and a reminder that nobility of character mattered as much as nobility of blood, Lord. Aldrich approached with a document case, his expression transformed from its usual stern calculation to something approaching paternal satisfaction. "The marriage contract between Highmere and Westmarch," he announced, presenting an elaborately prepared document. "I took the liberty of having it prepared in anticipation of favorable proceedings. It acknowledges Lady Catrin's heritage while ensuring the political stability of both houses." As Rowan and Catrin signed their names to the contract that would unite their lives and their houses, Willem stood nearby with tears in his eyes. His daughter had not only found legitimacy for her love, but had honored her mother's memory by choosing the same courage Catrin had shown 25 years before. "She would be so proud," he whispered to Lord Aldrich, who had moved to stand beside him. "As should you be," Aldrich replied, his voice gentler than Willem had ever heard it. "Your daughter has shown remarkable character throughout this ordeal. The duchy will be fortunate to have her as its duchess." The simple coronet that had been crafted for Catrin reflected her unique position, elegant but not ostentatious, noble but not remote from the common people she had lived among all her life. As Rowan placed it gently on her head, he spoke words that only she could hear. "You will always be the little girl who gave me her heart so freely," he said softly. "But now you're also the woman who will help me rule with wisdom and compassion. And you will always be the young man who told me to come back when I was older," she replied, touching the smooth river stone that still rested in her pocket. "Thank you for waiting." The celebration that followed transformed Westbridge Castle into a scene from the greatest romantic ballads. Musicians played, nobles danced, and toasts were raised to the couple who had proven that true love could indeed conquer the barriers that society placed in its path. As evening approached, Rowan and Catrin found themselves standing together on a balcony overlooking the rolling countryside that stretched toward Briarstead. In the distance, they could see smoke rising from the chimneys of the village where their story had begun. "When shall we marry?" Rowan asked, his arm around her waist as they watched the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and rose. "Soon," Catrin replied, leaning into his warmth. "But not so soon that we don't have time to plan a ceremony that honors both traditions, the grandeur your position requires and the simple joy our hearts desire. A wedding that bridges two worlds. Like our love, exactly like our love." As the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, Lady Catrin of Westmarch and Duke Rowan of Highmere stood together, no longer separated by the circumstances of birth or the constraints of social convention. They had fought for their love and won, not through defying the laws of their world, but by discovering truths that transformed those laws entirely. The little girl, who had declared her love so fearlessly, had become a woman worthy of a duke's hand. The young man who had spoken with such kindness had become a leader wise enough to choose love over mere political convenience. And tomorrow, they would begin planning a wedding that would unite not just two hearts, but two houses, two worlds, and two different ways of understanding what it meant to live a life of purpose and joy. The childhood promise had been kept. The impossible had become inevitable. Love had triumphed. The wedding bells of Highmere Chapel rang out across the countryside on a morning when spring seemed to have arrived early, as if the very earth celebrated the union that had captured the hearts of noble and commoner alike. The ancient stones had been decorated with wild flowers from the meadows, where Catrin and Rowan had shared their secret meetings, while banners bearing both the Highmere Hawk and the Westmarch Rose created a canopy of colour above the assembled guests. It was a ceremony that bridged two worlds, just as their love had done. In the front pews sat the great nobles of the kingdom, dukes and duchesses, lords and ladies whose bloodlines stretched back centuries. But filling the remainder of the chapel were the people of Briarstead village and the surrounding countryside, farmers and merchants, craftsmen and labourers who had known Catrin all her life and loved her for the woman she had always been. Regardless of the noble blood that now legitimised her place among them, Thomas Harver sat near the back, his honest face bright with genuine joy for the woman whose heart he had never truly won, but whose happiness he had always desired. Beside him, Eleanor Fletcher dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief, remembering her own late sister-in-law and the secret she had helped preserve until it could transform a life. At the altar, Duke Rowan waited in the blue and silver of his house, but his eyes never left the chapel doors. When they finally opened to reveal his bride, the collective intake of breath from the assembled guests spoke to the vision she presented. Lady Catrin wore her mother's wedding dress, carefully restored and adjusted to fit her perfectly. The ivory silk seemed to glow in the morning light, streaming through the stained glass windows, while the delicate lace that had once graced Lady Catrin of Westmarch now adorned her daughter on the most important day of her life. On her head sat not the elaborate crown of a duchess, but a simple circlet of silver set with pearls, elegant in its restraint, noble without being ostentatious. But it was not the dress or the crown that held every eye. It was the radiant joy on Catrin's face as she walked down the aisle on her father's arm, seeing at last the fulfillment of dreams that had sustained her through years of uncertainty. Willem's pride was evident in every step as he escorted his daughter toward her future. The farmer who had loved a runaway, noble and raised their child with wisdom, and Patience now saw that child take her rightful place in the world while never forgetting the humble virtues that had shaped her. Character. The ceremony itself was conducted by Father Marcus, the ancient priest who had performed the secret wedding of Catrin's parents a quarter-century before. His voice, though weakened by age, carried clearly through the chapel as he spoke of love that endures, promises that are kept, and the mysterious ways that destiny sometimes requires patience before revealing its design. "Love is not merely an emotion," he said as Catrin and Rowan exchanged the vows they had written themselves, "but a choice made new each day, a commitment to see in another person not just who they are, but who they might become. Today, we witness not just the union of two hearts, but the fulfillment of a promise made in innocence and kept through courage." When Rowan slipped the wedding ring onto Catrin's finger, he spoke words that echoed across the years to a harvest festival where a little girl had declared her love with fearless certainty. "I told you once to come back when you were older," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you for keeping that promise and for teaching me that some dreams are worth waiting for. And I told you once that I would marry you," Catrin replied, tears of joy streaming down her cheeks. "Thank you for having the patience to let me grow into the woman worthy of your love." The kiss that sealed their union was witnessed not just by the great and noble, but by the simple and true, a reminder that love recognizes no boundaries of birth or station when it finds its proper home. The celebration that followed transformed the manor grounds into a festival that would be remembered for generations. Tables laden with the finest foods available sat alongside others, bearing the simple, hearty fare of village tradition. Musicians played both courtly dances and country reels, ensuring that every guest, regardless of their station, could participate in the joy of the day. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of the celebration was how naturally the two worlds blended. Noble ladies found themselves chatting with village wives about children and harvest seasons, while great lords discovered that farmers and blacksmiths had wisdom to offer about everything from weather patterns to the management of resources. Lady Beatrice, radiant in green silk and clearly enjoying the festivities, was seen dancing with young knights and chatting animatedly with village elders. Her gracious acceptance of the changed circumstances had only enhanced her reputation, and rumors already suggested that several eligible nobles were reconsidering her availability with newfound interest. As evening approached, Catrin found herself standing in the same garden where she had once walked with nervous steps. Approaching a duke she barely dared to hope might remember her. Now she stood there as his wife, wearing the simple golden band that marked her as his partner in all things, surrounded by the life they would build together. "Do you think she would have approved?" Catrin asked, touching the locket that held her mother's portrait, the one piece of jewelry she had owned before discovering her true heritage. "I think she would have been proud beyond measure," Rowan replied, pulling her close. "Not just of the Duchess you've become, but of the woman you were before anyone knew you had noble blood. That's what I fell in love with, Catrin, not your lineage, but your heart." The years that followed proved the wisdom of their choice and the strength of the love that had brought them together. As Duke and Duchess of Hymir, they ruled with a combination of traditional wisdom and innovative compassion that became a model for other noble houses. Catrin never forgot her humble beginnings or the people who had shaped her character. The policies she helped establish created new opportunities for capable individuals to rise based on merit rather than birth alone, while maintaining the stability and structure that protected their society from chaos. Their first child, a daughter born 2 years after their wedding, was named Catrin, in honor of the grandmother she would never meet, but whose courage had made her parents' happiness possible. She grew up playing in fields where her mother had worked as a child, learning the value of honest labor alongside the responsibilities of noble birth. The old mill where Catrin and Rowan had shared their secret meetings became a place of pilgrimage for young couples throughout the duchy, a reminder that true love sometimes requires patience, courage, and faith in possibilities that seem impossible to others. Thomas Harver married a kind widow from the neighboring village and found the quiet happiness he had always deserved. Eleanor Fletcher lived to see her own granddaughter elevated to lady's maid in the ducal household, a position that brought both families great pride. Lord Aldrich, who had fought so hard against the match initially, became one of its strongest supporters, often pointing to the political benefits of having a duchess who understood both the needs of the nobility and the concerns of common folk. And in the great hall of Hymir Manor, in a place of honor above the ducal throne, hung a family portrait painted 5 years after their wedding. It showed Duke Rowan and Duchess Catrin with their 3 children, surrounded by symbols of both their noble heritage and their humble beginnings. A reminder that the greatest strength sometimes comes from bridging different worlds rather than choosing between them. But perhaps the most treasured item in all their possessions was a small, smooth riverstone, kept in a place of honor in their private chambers. It served as a daily reminder of the promise that had started everything, the faith of a 10-year-old girl, and the kindness of a young man who had told her to come back when she was older. She had come. Back he had waited. Love had found a way, and in the end, the little peasant girl who had fallen for the Duke discovered that some dreams however impossible they may seem, are simply destiny wearing the disguise of hope. The childhood promise kept had become a legacy that would inspire lovers throughout the kingdom for generations to come. True love, they learned, doesn't always arrive when we expect it or in the form we anticipate. But when it is real, when it is patient, when it is brave enough to fight for what seems impossible, it has the power to transform not just two hearts, but the entire world around them. The promise had been kept, the dream had become reality, and they lived, as all true lovers should, not just happily, but purposefully ever after.